Mute myself. Hi everyone, welcome. I know people are just still coming in. I'm kind of omitting people from the waiting room at the same time. So I'm going to deliver just a really brief housekeeping introduction. My name is Rebecca Atkinson. I'm the events programmer and content editor at the Museum Association, and I'll be facilitating the event today, sort of largely for the background. For the benefit of any blind or partially sighted people, I am a white cis female with brown hair, and my pronouns are she, her. So yeah, welcome. Sorry, I'm keeping an eye on the waiting room at the same time, so sorry if I look a bit distracted. But welcome to All Together Now, embedding community participation. It's fantastic to see so many people joining us today. Just to let you know right from the beginning that if you require closed captioning, you can turn this on now via the live transcript button on the bottom of your on the bottom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. This event has been run on Zoom meetings, and we'd love it if you're able to keep your camera on so that it feels like we are all in the room together as much as possible. But do please mute yourself unless asked otherwise. We'll be using the chat function today. Just so we know who's here, it'd be great if you could just take a moment now to share your name, where you're zooming in from, and any thoughts on today, why you've joined, what you're looking forward to. That'd be lovely. You can also use the chat to respond to the issues raised and ask any questions. For the latter, please can you put Q&A at the start of your question, and if applicable, let us know if it's for a specific speaker. If you're also tweeting about the event, you can use the hashtag #MAParticipation. The meeting's going to stay open all day today during the breaks as well. So if your internet drops out or you need to leave for any reason, that's fine. You can just rejoin via the waiting room. And the recording from today will also be available on the MA website early next week, as well as a transcript of the chat. Finally, just to let you know, due to unforeseen circumstances, Claire McDade is unable to join us today as a speaker. So that means we'll have slightly longer to hear from Sally Shaw and Sharondeep Yuanda. And as a completely unconnected bonus, Harry Cumberbatch is going to join us, join Sandra Griffiths during her keynote address, and he'll be speaking about his work promoting and developing African heritage projects and exhibitions with museums and community members. So that's all from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Sally Colvin, the Programmes Manager at the Museum Association, to officially start the event.
Good morning. Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome everyone. Welcome to All Together Now, our event about community participation. I hope that you're all well this morning and that you're settling in. I hope you've got tea, biscuits, whatever else it is that you need. In the spirit of the topic today, we've got a really collaborative format. You'll get to hear from some brilliant people with some fascinating recent experience, but throughout the day, you'll be able to ask questions and reflect on your own practice. As Rebecca says, my name's Sally Colvin. I'm the Programmes Manager at the Museums Association. I'm a white woman in my 40s. Don't like doing that bit of the announcement, but I am. I'm wearing a white shirt with long brown hair and glasses. I'm going to try and steer you through today. And while I'll constantly urge you to add to the chat, ask lots of questions and contribute to discussions, I confess that I find keeping track of the comments and the presentations and my own thoughts a bit of a challenge. So bear with me and do have a laugh to yourself when Rebecca has to chip in with something that I've missed, which you're very welcome to do, Rebecca. Now, I come to chairing this event with 20 years behind me in the museum sector, and my simple observation in that time, and possibly one that those of us in this space take for granted, is that there's been a really fundamental shift in how most UK museums expect to involve and appeal to communities. And that's not to say that everyone's good at it, but that common mantra today of with, not for, hadn't yet become normal 15 or 20 years ago. In the early 2000s, I worked in collections and exhibitions research. And to be honest, it didn't really occur to me to actually ask people what was important to them. And if some people in museums did, I don't think it carried that much weight with the people that I worked with. So in the time since, there's been some really beneficial change in moving from things like talking about objects to talking about stories, and from things like C2DE to a much more nuanced understanding of underrepresentation. I find the balance of power in that terminology fascinating. Everything now is in the codes. We're co-programmed, co-produced, co-curated. But I see now that funders are starting to shift more towards supporting programs that are community-led. And so that's notable with things like community-led recovery from COVID, for example. I've worked at the Museums Association for a long time now, and my job's developing programs for people in museums. So I've been involved with various programs over the years that evidence that change over time. The big one of those is that I run the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund. That fund has run for 11 years now. And when it started, it was about unlocking the potential of underused collections almost in and of themselves. And now it's about collections and engagement in equal measure, where really the investment in the stuff is about using it as a vehicle to social impact. In 2020, we also offered digital innovation and engagement grants in partnership with UKRI. And these were about building on the kind of digital experimentation, digital engagement, I should say, during that first lockdown, and using that to engage underrepresented audiences. And the point in there that I was really pleased about was that we asked museums to use their own evidence to tell us who their underrepresented audience was and how they wanted to reach them. And I think that's a really important shift for funders to recognise sustainable and relevant relationships. So I think we're making progress there. I've got a couple more things to name check. In 2019, we ran a pilot programme with support from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation called Partnerships with Purpose. And in that, we ran a series of events in cities and regions around the UK that were intending to foster partnerships between community organisations and museums. As far as it went, it was great at making introductions and building confidence, but it was also a real eye-opener for me. It taught me how important place and context is in making a relationship fit. And it also showed me just how top-down, even remote, some organisations can be without meaning to be at all. And so partnerships with purpose was stopped basically by the pandemic. And I'm not sure that even if we could restart it, the same model would work now. But I am keen to understand what the MA can do to support community participation and partnerships. And you'll get a chance to tell me later on in the day. So have a think about that. The last observation from me is to think about the impact that COVID's had on community participation. Of course, there are devastating and continuing impacts of COVID all over the place, and I don't seek to downplay that in any way. But the experience of the last 2 years has meant that more people in more museums have thought about communities. So having to switch how we deliver has meant that more people have had to think about who they're trying to engage and where they are, rather than starting with that museum building and trying to get people over the threshold. So into that situation, I'd like to bring in the MA's Power to the People framework. It gives a structure to self-assess how good your organisation's participatory practice is. It's spread over 6 areas like leadership and governance and evaluation. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the framework, and it's not perfect, but I would wager that if you look at your practice over the pandemic, many of your organisations will have improved in that framework because of that necessary change towards working with communities. And I think that knowing that within that framework can be quite powerful for advocacy within your own organisation at the moment, particularly at this difficult time of figuring out what museums can afford to keep doing. Let's move on to telling you a bit more about how today will run. We've got 4 sessions taking us up to 4 p.m. In a few moments, we'll have our keynote presentation. And then we'll have a session that I'm sure you can all identify with about kind of making change when resources are in short supply. As Rebecca said, unfortunately, Claire McDade from the Skylark 9 Recovery Project can't join us for that one. So we'll put some links to her work in the chat, and we'll take the opportunity to make sure we involve all your thoughts and feedback and questions in the extra time that we have in that session. After lunch, we'll hear from 4 speakers about breaking down barriers in new and challenging practice. And then finally, we'll end with a discussion session. So for that discussion session, we want to make sure you all get a chance to think and talk about what you've heard today and to relate it back to your own working worlds. So in that last half hour, we're going to put you in breakout rooms and ask you to discuss 2 key questions that I think Rebecca's going to show on the slide now. And they are, what can the sector do to progress participatory practice? And what learning will you take away and apply from the event today? So the task is firstly to think big about the future of the whole sector. I've described a bit about how I think community activity has been historically a bit of a poor relation in museums, But I also think that the kind of leading practice we'll hear about today and the changes through COVID are affecting that situation. You'll have very different perspectives. So this question is a chance to discuss what we need as a sector. What are your wants and needs at that overview level? And then the second question is to mull over as we go through the day, how can you apply this to your own daily lives? You're all here because you're interested in participatory practice, so you know how to reflect and get the most out of events. So this is your chance to kind of formulate your thoughts about how you can learn from and apply what the wonderful speakers today are going to talk about. So let's move on with our first session and our keynote speakers. Sandra Griffiths joins us from Red Earth Collective. That's a Black-led organisation that uses the arts to challenge mental health stigma and discrimination in racialised and marginalised communities. Sandra's career has focused on challenging the mental health inequalities faced by Black communities, and in 2018, that led to the founding of the Red Earth Collective. Harry Cumberbatch will join Sandra today, bringing with him an amazing breadth of experience working with and for community organisations, mainly in the East End of London. And for this audience, I'll highlight that he was on the consultative committee for the Sugar and Slavery Gallery at the Museum of London Docklands, and is now an associate mental health manager for the East London Mental Health Foundation Trust. So thanks for joining us, Sandra and Harry. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sally, for that really inspiring and context-setting introduction. So I'm Sandra Griffiths. I'm a middle-aged Black woman. I have to own that. I'm middle-aged, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm based in Birmingham. And as Sally said, I am the director for the Red Earth Collective that uses the arts to stimulate conversations about mental health and well-being, particularly focused on African and Caribbean communities, but more increasingly other communities that are described as kind of racialized communities. So that's who I am, and I'm going to ask my colleague who's co-presenting with me to introduce himself.
Good morning, conference. Thank you, Sandra, for the invitation to take part in what it was a very important conference. As mentioned, my name is Harry Cumberbatch, and I've been around for a long time, 78 years to be exact. I'm still involved in community work with the Tony Cheeseman Foundation and feel blessed that with having a very supportive and loving family. My relationship with the archives and museums began in 1999, when as a support worker for the user-led group Tower Hamlets African Caribbean Mental Health Organization, which we call THACMO, we observed and brought to the attention of the early African presence, which was missing from Tower Hamlets Archives and Library Service published book, which was titled 1,000 Years of Tower Hamlets History. Can we have slide one, please?
Okay, so just before you continue, Harry, can I just let the conference know that our aim during our presentation is to do kind of two things. One is to share with you our experiences of working in community organisations with museums, and also to share with you some of our thoughts and insights about how the relationship between communities and community organisations could be strengthened with museums. And our focus is African and Caribbean communities, but we believe that our experiences may have some relevance and connection with other communities that consider themselves to be either marginalised or excluded in communities or in society. So just wanted to kind of frame the context for our presentation. So back to you, Harry.
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, this slide here is the front cover of that book I just spoke about. As you can see, it's 1,000 years of Tower Hamlets history. And the first time we were mentioned in that book was 1935, and that was about Somalian sailors coming to the ports of the London docks. So we brought that to their attention, and we had a meeting. So after that meeting, we decided as a group to get motivated and to develop a project titled Health Through History. First, to put the record straight and to help the members develop a positive outlook of their past. They produced in 2002 the book called Power Writers, which was really a booklet, and it was updated to a book in 2004. This book highlighted 5 African writers who lived in the 18th century East London, plus a walking tour and an exhibition. Can I have slide 2, please? As you can see from the book, the slide, the 5 writers we covered were Phyllis Wheatley, Ukasol Gramasol, John Moran, Uliada Equiana, and Kuba Otoba Kugana. These were all present here in the 1790s in East London. And it was good to bring that to the attention of others and help us really to develop the confidence that young people, that mostly the members needed to enhance their mental health. We took up the suggestion from one of our events evaluation forums, which suggested that we should look at Black settlement in the local Dockland area. After approaching the museum in Docklands, as it was then called, we began to work on the idea and got a small grant to develop a project. Thackmore worked in partnership with the museum in Docklands and the National Archives to hold a reminiscence conference in 2004. The event was titled History of the West Indian Seamen, who sailed regularly during the 1950s and 60s on the Harrison shipping lines to the London West Indian docks. The conference was a sold-out event and brought down many barriers, especially working in a grade 1 listed building and accommodating some cultural differences. One of the conference recommendations were to keep the seamen stories alive, and the conference report was launched in October for a Black History Month event that year. We also started work with the Humanities Education Center of Tower Hamlets to produce a teaching resource CD for Key Stage True Peoples titled Sailors of the Caribbean. Can I have slide 3, please? Yeah, this is the CD, cover of the CD, and this was an education pack which was available for Key Stage 3 young people in the Tower Hamlets, and I'm sure other boroughs if they wanted to make use of it, but it was very much related to the docks and very early history of migration here from the Caribbean, because many sailors settled and started families also. From the successful partnership, the museum invited Thackmore to be part of their lottery bid in 2005 as a community partner to commemorate 200 years of the abolition of the slave trade. The bid was successful, and we were thanked for our contribution. I was invited to sit on a consultative committee that produced the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery. Like most 207 bicentenary projects, Thackmore contributed to the York University evaluation of the bicentenary. Can I have slide 4, please? This is a very interesting slide. As you can see, the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery with Robert Mulligan statue, which was outside. You will notice on the left, it's covered because that was something we felt was appropriate at the time having a slave owner and someone who didn't respect the human life and all of the atrocities that went with the Atlantic slave trade. we felt that the least we could have done was cover him. And now I can say that it have been removed, but we were at least in the beginning of saying, well, statues like this are very much not appropriate in public places, maybe in a museum, but definitely not in a public place. Unfortunately, in the years that followed, there was no structure developed to build on the relationship with the Museum of London Docklands, which left the members disappointment and a feeling of being used because there were some high expectations which were not fulfilled. My last collaboration was with the Royal Armouries, best known as the National Museum of Arms and Armour, based at the Tower of London, where we produced a leaflet and a booklet on African history at the Tower of London. Can we have slide 5, please? You can see here, the first one on the left is the leaflet, and it looked at the history that we could research about Black people from 1675 to 1774. Very interesting leaflet, but that's also available to share. And the booklet, African History at the Tower of London, is about a 12-page booklet, looking from the crown jewels to all aspects that we could find of African history in the Tower. So that's also available. Chair, in conclusion, I will say that TACMO, as a small Black community organization, did not feel fully recognized for the contributions they made. Both small and larger archives and museums, in my view, do not truly appreciate the cultural contributions and the amazing natural curatorial grassroots skills, which can enhance many heritage collaborations. I will stop there for now, and Sandra, answer any questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Harry, for sharing with us your journey with East London Museum. If I just share a little bit about my experience of working with museums, which is not as extensive as Harry's, but in sharing my journey, both myself and Harry have identified a couple of things that we think could be addressed and could improve the relationship, particularly with Black communities and museums. And we hope that you'll be able to see some relevance to the communities that you're working with too. So my experience of working with museums comes from a slightly different place. So most of my work has been very focused on improving the mental health and of African and Caribbean communities. Some of you will be familiar with some of the stories about poorer outcomes for Black people using mental health services. And this is a story that has been around for many years, for 30 years plus. And I have worked on a number of initiatives across the country. So I'm based in Birmingham, but I was living in London for 25 years, and that's where I met Harry. And many of the initiatives that I've been involved with, both very locally and regionally and nationally, have recognised the value and the importance of paying attention to people's heritage and their identity as part of their recovery from mental illness, or making sense of their mental illness, and helping them to have a much more, through reconnecting with and understanding their heritage and their identities, and helping services who provide mental health support for communities through that increased understanding of how heritage is important, one's identity, one's past is important because it informs one's present. That the focus on heritage and identity is a really important space within which we can begin to address some of the mental health challenges and opportunities for people to recover. So I come to the heritage space, working with museums from that position. And I moved to Birmingham about 8 years ago, from the Midlands originally. And in my first year of working in Birmingham, we set up an organisation. I set up an organisation with 2 other colleagues called Catalyst for Change, which is a West Midlands mental health hub. And through that work, we were able to kind of connect with a whole range of different organisations and held events. And one of those events, Birmingham Museum, came along to that event, which was an event which was just raising awareness of mental health and wellbeing in the community. And so that was our first encounter, that the museum came to our space to hear, to connect, to understand about the African and Caribbean communities' experiences. And that led to us then having conversations and being invited or being commissioned to develop kind of one-off events around Black History Month and this year, Windrush Day. So our journey, our relationship with the museum is different to the one that Harry has shared. So there's the outreach that the museum undertook to kind of connect with the communities, the local communities that they were seeking to engage, and there was an intent and purpose in reaching and engaging to understand the communities and recognizing that they weren't getting many Black people through the doors. Yeah, even though there were exhibitions and activities that had a African or Caribbean focus, unless there were particular sort of, connections with community organizations that were already engaging with African Caribbean communities to help to facilitate bringing audiences to those exhibitions. Most of the people who were attending those exhibitions were mainly white or not Black. And it was that experience that brought the museum to our events. And I think that that's a really important, and it is an important kind of strategy, which I'm observing is happening more and more, but it's certainly an important step as we look at how do we build better relationships between the Black communities and museums, where there is a concern that there is a museum which has space, has resources, has knowledge, has expertise, and is a space where people can reimagine their past, a past and a future that is potentially free of racial injustice and promotes social justice. So it's an important space. It's an important resource, museums, but yet in a number of cities and towns across the country, there's still spaces where Black people feel that they don't belong, yeah, even with exhibitions that have a particular focus. And I guess that speaks to sometimes sort of class issues about people who are creating the work may sometimes be disconnected from the local communities. And it's not unusual to see and visit exhibitions that have been created from people outside of the locality, the space where the museum is based. So just reflecting on our lessons and our experiences and what we'd like to share as kind of how we might strengthen the relationship between Black communities and museums, and for that matter, other communities that are underrepresented in the museum's work, and also underrepresented in the way in which museums program what they do and govern museums. I guess there are two broad themes that we want to kind of put to you. And we recognize that what we're sharing, there will be different stories across the country, and there will be some areas that have done much more work in addressing some of the themes that we're going to share with you, but we recognize even that there's still work to be done. So the two broad themes are around partnership and pledge. So if I just very quickly, I've got 4 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay, that's gone really quick. So I'll just have to speak really quickly. So under partnership, there's a couple of things. One is, yes, participation's important, but we really want to talk more about co-production here. Yeah, it's not just about participating, because that can sound very not as engaging, or not recognizing that there's skills and expertise and knowledge that communities bring. We want to co-produce. So when you're applying for the large grants, and they may not be as big as you'd like them to be, but when you're applying for funding for work, why not do joint bids, joint applications? My experience is that sometimes, museums, they get the money, and then there is some consultation, but then in the writing up and pulling together of the application, community organisations are not involved with that. The money comes, and then there's another consultation about, okay, we've got the money now, we can work out maybe what role you can play, rather than seeing community organisations as part of the whole process. So co-production is really, really important. Linked to that is just acknowledging the power imbalance. There is power imbalance between community organisations. The average income for Black-led organisations is 30K. A year, and so there needs to be more recognition that museums have a lot of resources and skills at their disposal, which could be shared and should be shared with community organisations. Sometimes large institutions can completely ignore or not acknowledge or value the expertise within communities. And there needs to be just an acknowledgement that there's a sharing and valuing of expertise and knowledge, both within museums and in the community. There are many heritage workers that are living in the community and working in community. And it is important that museums map and understand and value that expertise. There are some difficult conversations to be had when we talk about partnership. And some of that relates to racism, some of that relates to power, some of that relates to you've got resources we haven't, you've got more capacity we don't. We need to have those, if you're going to have genuine partnership, you kind of have to have some of those difficult conversations. And many partnerships will have stories to tell about how they have overcome those difficult conversations. You have to have them, but also just be purposeful and intent, be clear about why you're having those difficult conversations, and speak to other colleagues about having those difficult conversations. And what they've learned. Lastly, the kind of pledge, I think there needs to be a clear intent that you will address racial justice, injustice, recognizing that the work, the exhibitions that are within museums will have and do have impact on communities, and that we have to look at the stories that communities want to tell. So it is important that there's a conversation between museums and the community, a purposeful one about restoring or addressing racial injustice. I want to just leave you with two things. So despite some of our experiences, and we've clearly had good experiences, but there continue to be experiences where communities feel excluded, there's short-term projects, there's a lack of representation in the programming and in the governance structures of museums. Many people in the community see the value of the museum's function and purpose in our communities. And we want to develop dynamic partnerships between museums and communities to allow all forms of knowledge and wisdom to flourish and to be seen. And that the museums, for many people, and certainly for myself, create a space where you can imagine a world where there is social and racial justice. And that is one of our key aims at Red Earth, to be committed to partnership and to see the museums as a site for exploring and reimagining racial and social justice. Okay.
Amazing.
Sorry.
Thank you, Sandra and Harry.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I ignored your time check. Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right. We've made it within a couple of minutes. That'll do nicely.
Great.
As Rebecca said in the chat, please do get your questions in. I think it's a fascinating starting point for us. I mean, obviously, most of this audience is people who work in museums. So I think it's very good for us to hear a perspective from all of the people that we try so hard to work with, and to have that context at the beginning of the day. I really enjoyed the kind of the final positive point you ended on about communities in general terms, seeing the value of museums and wanting to be in on that. And I think that's something that we need to kind of hold dear. I would also echo your point as well about getting in early on the partnerships if you're looking at funding bids together. I spend quite a lot of my time reading funding bids, and it really jumps out if partnerships are genuine, and if the needs of both partners are represented in what's in front of you. So I think that's a really good thing to bring in. So we've had a question in the chat that came through when Harry was talking earlier on about saying that his group and his work wasn't recognised in the way that he would have wanted in the museums that he was working with. Wonder, Harry, if you could give us a bit more context about that, about the recognition that you would like to see, what you would like it to be.
Okay, thanks. Whoever the person that answered that question, thank you. But I think Sandra answered it. So it didn't really much for me to say that, because if I don't think the person would have answered that question if they had heard Sandra before they answered that question. So as far as we were concerned, all the things that Sandra said is what we would expect from any collaboration. And I'll just add to something that Sandra maybe have said it in a way, but I would just put a different spin on it. It isn't just a small group, it's a wider community. So it isn't like you're pleasing an individual or two or three people. It's the community can collectively feels that it is part, and they're part of whatever is happening, and it's being treated fairly and respectfully. Amazing,
thank you. We've had another question in that is really interesting about how to sustain relationships. So much of the work that we do in partnership is based on short-term funding and on grant funding. So can you give any insight or any examples about how to retain those relationships after a funding period ends?
So probably less in the kind of heritage and museum space, but if I can draw on my work outside of that in sort of mental health and arts space, I would say that how we have, for example, been able to retain and build meaningful and sustainable relationships. So between one of the organizations that I'm working on. So Catalyst for Change, for example, if I just focus on that for a bit. So that's a West Midlands African Caribbean mental health hub. And we have developed over the last, we were established in 2015, and we have been able to sustain an ongoing relationship with our local mental health trust. Yeah, how have we done that? By continuing to have regular conversations, by coming together and having some of those difficult conversations. You know, we describe ourselves as positive deviants, so we will bring up issues that are presented to us from our community, and we will bring that to the table. Yeah, whether it's about restraint and the increasing restraint that Black people experience, or whether it's that, you know, carers don't feel that their voices are listened to by, you know, clinicians. We bring that to the table, and the Trust have worked really hard to build their capacity and their knowledge around addressing some of the inequalities that we have brought to their table. And they, you know, they have sought advice and support from organizations that have an equality focus to learn, to understand, you know, the impact of racism, to speak to their colleagues about, you know, how they have addressed race inequality in their service. So for us, it's about an ongoing conversation, and you know, encouraging our the Trust to kind of reach out to other colleagues, to share with them, facilitate sometimes conversations between them and staff about the kind of services and competencies that Black service users seek. So for me, you know, in creating a forum for that conversation, but also kind of encouraging and basically saying to our colleagues that it can't just be a conversation with a few interested individuals around this. How can we support those individuals to kind of to have further conversations with the rest of the organisation and get the board on board around this agenda? Because again, there is a challenge always that, and I think this is shifting a little bit, that you have conversations, community organisations have conversations with community engagement posts in institutions, yeah? And that's it, that's the extent of it. And sometimes those community engagement posts have very little influence in their organisation. And that will vary, of course, depending on the organisation, depending on the individual. But part of our conversation is kind of how can we, you know, with those people who are ready to have that conversation, how can we support them to kind of push this agenda across the organisation and think together about how we can do that? Yeah.
That's a really nice way of putting it. We've had another question from Naomi in the chat about if you're not in that leadership position, where do you start? You know, if you haven't got the opportunity to write a funding bid, where do you start? And I think some of what you've just said indicates that the relationship has to start somewhere, and your community links can help give you the voice to communicate with your seniors and governing bodies. Mm-hmm. We've also had a question in about the resources you would recommend about having those difficult conversations and building the confidence to have those difficult conversations. This was particularly in the context of racial justice. And are there any resources you can point to for starting that?
Well, I guess, you know, some of you will know about Museum Detox, which is the network of heritage workers in the museum from racialized communities. There is a resource there, Museum X. There's the Centre for Knowledge Equity. And also maybe just having the conversations with the community organisations themselves, and perhaps the staff that work in your museums that are from those communities. You know, they will have, and, you know, resources and maybe expertise to enable that, to facilitate that conversation. So I think sometimes we can be so busy looking out and, for others to, to kind of, to start that conversation or help that conversation. I think that that's right, but start internally. Who do you know internally that's got that expertise? Sometimes people can completely overlook the expertise within their own organization. And we encourage people to do that. But, that's what I suppose when I think about how organizations can not always see community organizations as also being a site of knowledge and expertise, and not just coming to museums to kind of for resources or to kind of just do a project. There's expertise within community organizations. Just ask, but have the conversation internally about what do we know, what don't we know, what is it that we need to address, and have the conversations with people. This is what we're planning to do. Who knows? Who can help with this? Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a really good and positive point for us to wrap on about just start the conversation and find out where you can take it to. Do you have? I've got one question to finish off on. Is kind of a future gazing question of what do you think the next big thing is? What's the big improvement that you'd like to see in the next couple of years, potentially with a COVID context, of what's going to be important coming up for the relationship between museums and organizations like yours?
Okay. Harry, do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, speaking from my experience working with a very small organization, and a big institution, the stigma around mental health really is a wider question for the society, not just the museum. And there's a general ignorance of the African world experience. And that is an educational area, but these are things that have to be recognized. And I think Sandra said it all in a nice little package around co-producing, power, imbalance, and pledging, which for me is now about the willingness of museums and institutions like yourself to really take it forward. And I hope it will be done.
I think for me, probably three things. The co-production, maybe that's four things. So the co-production piece, but there's also kind of just paying more attention to more recent histories of Black communities. So not just focused on Windrush and slavery, but really opening up, different stories of the diverse communities and engaging the communities in the stories that they want to see and hear. I think that's going to be that feels really important to kind of consider what are those stories that you're not hearing, that's not being represented. Because I was really struck with the Black Lives Matter conversations and activities that for some Black people, they had no idea, some young Black people had no idea about the Black British experience, sort of pre-1948 and post-1948.
Yeah.
And that wasn't just Black young people, it was, wider, communities as well. So there's something about how do we tell our stories about our contribution, Black communities' contribution in society. I think also inviting museums to really interrogate the material, the exhibitions that they've got, and how is this contributing to racial justice? How could what's the offer? What's the the kind of plan? And just acknowledging that museums are a space where you can reimagine, a future where where it's much more inclusive, but there's a real intent to to promote racial and social justice. Yeah, there's that commitment. Then what could that look like? Yeah. And lastly, sorry, that's probably 6 things. A real investment in supporting community members to be curators and to co-program exhibitions and activities. And in your last magazine, or the Museum Takeover, Museum X Takeover in Museums Today, there was lots of amazing examples of existing community curating activities and training programs. That's what we want to see: community members, co-creating, co-programming museums that are in their locality. That's what we want to see.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you very much, Harry.
Can I have one?
We're going to go in. Oh, sorry, Harry. Go on. Go
okay.
on.
I just would like to say I have 50 copies of Poor Writers and African History at the Tower of London, and they're available, and we can offer that as a donation to the museum.
Thank you.
Your work.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Harry. We're going to go into. Have I frozen? I'm going to carry on in the hope you can hear me.
Okay.
We're going to go into a comfort break now and join us back here at 12 o'clock for our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's been so good to have your questions and comments flowing in the chat. So do keep that up. It really, when you're speaking online, it can feel like you're, us and the speakers are giving out the energy, and it's really great to have that coming back in the questions and the chat. So we're now entering the No Time, No Money session of the programme, where we're looking at sustainable and systemic change. So really we're asking, what do you need to do to turn good intentions and your own hard work last? And for anybody who missed the earlier part of the session, Claire McDade has unfortunately had to send her apologies today. So we're going to take the chance to hear a little bit more from Sally and from Sharondeep, and to get some time for some of your questions as well. If we can, when we get to the questions, I can invite some of you to unmute your microphones and ask your questions yourself. So when we get to that point, if you'd like you to do that, then send me a message or raise your hand using the Zoom reactions, raise your hand, and we'll try and get some more voices into the conversation. For now, though, our next speaker is Sally Shaw. So let's welcome her. She's the director of First Sight in Colchester in Essex. First Sight won the Art Fund Museum of the Year award earlier in 2021. And that's largely for their work supporting communities during the pandemic. So let's hear more. Welcome, Sally.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Give us a nod. Great. Okay, I've got a pretty shabby signal today, and there's some hoovering going on in the background. Sorry, declare my bad timing right now. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Bear with me whilst I get nervous and do that. Okay, can you see that? Nice and pink. Great. Okay, so I'm Sally. I'm the director of First Sight in Colchester. I've been there since 2016, 5.5 glorious years, 2 of which spent in lockdown. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of First Sight to start with, because it's relevant to what we did in the last couple of years. And it's very relevant to the subject of no time, no money. How do you make change? Because it feels like that's been our consistent theme for 5.5 years. So I'm just going to run through a few slides about what it is that we do as an organisation, what journey we've been on for 5.5 years, and then 2 major projects, one of which we've been doing for a long time anyway, and one of which we did specifically during the last 2 years and was a direct response to the pandemic. And both examples speak to the subject of no time and no money, and what can you do, and how you kind of get over those hurdles, and what it feels like, and the kind of mindset maybe, which I think is probably the most important thing, is about mindset and just deciding to go for it. So First Sight, there we are. We are a contemporary art gallery. We're in Colchester Town Centre. Colchester is in North Essex. We're about 15 minutes away from the Suffolk border, but we're very Essex and we're very proud of it. I love this picture. It tells me everything that you need to know about First Sight in Colchester in many respects. It shows you our wonderful, crazy building, which is the Gold Banana, if anyone's in any doubt, in the foreground. And it shows you the town centre. It's saying my signal is now unstable, by the way, so if I get a bit crackly, I'm just going to press on, but wave at me if it goes really badly wrong. So it also shows our town centre, and what a whacking great contrast we really are in that town centre, and what a shock it must have been when this thing appeared. Not quite overnight. It was a slightly slow process to give the First Sight, and it was many people's project for quite a long time. But that's where we are, and it sort of says a lot. It's very different. It's very high contrast, but it's also, that contrast is kind of the thing that I get most excited about. And the town context is the thing where all the ideas have come from to make that gallery work. So I think it's a really beautiful image and I love it a lot. So we opened in 2011. It's our 10th birthday this year. How to celebrate a building when it's shut. That's been my other sort of strapline to the last 12 months. It's our 10th anniversary this year. When I got there in 2016, First Sight was in a total pickle. Many of you may know the story already, but I'll just recap very briefly and give you the terrible highlights. We were taken out of the Arts Council's national portfolio, so we'd had our main grant funding removed. We were in the local press pretty much every week in a really bad way. It was a political football. The gallery was being used as a way to score points against the various sort of political parties in Colchester. Our footfall had gone from about 150,000, I think 140,000 at its highest just after we opened in 2011, down to about 80,000. So everything had kind of fallen off a cliff, and things were just bad and very unhappy. And I got the job and thought, I think I can maybe do something about that. I don't know, I'll give it a go. I just couldn't see any reason why it couldn't work. I could see why perhaps it hadn't worked, but I couldn't see a reason why it definitely would never work. And I thought, I'm kind of interested in that. I'm interested in what's happened in this gallery and why it's got so difficult. And my main reading of it was, it felt like a place that had really lost its sense of purpose. And it was a gallery that didn't really know what it was and didn't really know who to speak to about how to find that out again. My background is in public art mostly. I spent about 20 years starting off trying to make my own terrible public art, which thankfully was a short-lived moment, then going on to make other people's for them, but then actually working on some pretty major public art commissions like the 4th Plinth in Trafalgar Square and for London Underground and for the Olympics. So my passion is very much about art out there in the world doing its thing and connecting with all sorts of people. And I just saw this as an opportunity to try and bring some of that thinking into a contemporary art gallery context, and how could you make it public and popular and make those things the real frontline story of what you do. So I thought this might be a good place to try to experiment and try that out. The main things that we do in First Sight is we celebrate and champion local and regional culture, but on a really, really high level. So we're very lucky to have people like Grayson Perry as a local artist, which is quite convenient. But we have many other artists in the region, and one of our biggest jobs is to really celebrate and preserve that culture, but also then create the next layer of it as well. Grayson's one element of it, and he enables us. When we did our Grayson Perry show in whenever, I think it was 2017. It was the highest attended show that we've ever done. It was something like 56,000 people came through the doors. That brought a lot of trust, and it enabled me to do a load of other shows about other artists who people had never heard of. So we do this wide range of thinking about culture in the region and telling that story. We're the biggest contemporary art gallery in the East region, and it's one of our jobs to do that. So that's one layer of what we do. We also work on pretty big national projects as well, and these have come about through different relationships that we've generated over the last few years, things that I've brought with me to First Sight from other jobs. We were a co-commissioner of the Millicent Fawcett statue in Parliament Square, which is just a nice image of, along with the 1418 Now First World War 100th anniversary programme and the Mayor of London. And the reason why we got asked was because even 2 or 3 years ago, our conversation around diversity, inclusion, equality and equity was beginning to get quite strong, and people were picking up on it. So we were invited to be involved in the conversation about who should make this the only artwork of a woman, by a woman in Parliament Square. It'll also be the last artwork in Parliament Square ever to be commissioned. So we snuck one lady in there right at the last hour. So we also work on big national projects at the same time. And I think it's really critical that we do, because it's often the other way around. There's often this conversation about things coming from London and going to Colchester and places like it. But actually what we did was enter that conversation on our own terms and say, yep, we're going to co-commission this with you. So it's really exciting to have that opportunity, and for people in Colchester to understand that their gallery on their doorstep is connected to something somewhere else on a different scale with other partners. And all of these relationships start to build social capital around what we're doing. And then more recently, we've started doing things internationally, purely by accident. I declare it now. So these are the front covers of our Artists Where the Home Is activity packs that we produced during 2020. And I'll talk more about those later on. But this was a complete happy accident. When we did that project, we didn't sit down and say, let's do an international project right now. We just made something happen really quickly. And it's an idea that had been knocking around in my head for quite a long time. And that seemed to be the right time to do it. And it just went international. Our timing was interesting. It's got a strange extra pink slide. I'm going to talk about Holiday Fun as the first big project. As I mentioned at the beginning, First Sight was not in a great shape when I first took over. Most people hated it. Nobody wanted to go in it. So I drew up a list of the people that hated it most and the people who were the most vociferous about this art gallery. And I basically just went and met everybody and had lots and lots and lots of conversations with them about what was happening in the area. I'm not from Colchester, not from Essex. I don't know a great deal about here. So I had to go and meet people to just go and find that out. And that's me going back to my kind of public art roots and thinking about context and looking at the place you're in to find material and information to show you what you should be doing and working things out that way around, rather than coming in with a bunch of ideas and sticking them on it. Look at what's there and let it show you perhaps what you should be doing. The Holiday Fun project emerged from a tiny little bit of money that we got from doing the Bainham Himmids touring show. We had something like £2,000 which I know for some is actually not a tiny amount of money, it's quite a substantial amount of money. But it was a blob for us that we could use, and the money came with a brief to connect with Black and minority ethnic families and communities in the area in Colchester on the occasion of Lebaina's exhibition with us. One of the people that I'd met in those early conversations was Rachel Walton, who runs another charity called African Families in the UK. And Rachel and I have been speaking pretty much non-stop for about 5 years about all sorts of things, very little to do with art most of the time, a lot to do with life and what's happening in Rachel's community, in my networks through First Sight, in our families, everything. We just talk about everything. And we have these very wide-ranging discussions about what's happening in Colchester and how we can contribute. So there's a sort of meeting of minds with Rachel and I in terms of our perception of our role in the community and what we're there to do. I sort of went into the conversation, my first conversation with Rachel, with many assumptions. And we might end up having a conversation about doing an exhibition with another Black artist potentially in the programme. What Rachel ended up telling me about was holiday hunger, which I completely had no idea about whatsoever. It was the biggest thing that her community were facing at the time, so she just told me straight, this is what's going on. I thought it was people not getting enough holidays. That's how much I knew of holiday hunger in the area. Rachel very patiently talked me through what it really means. And holiday hunger in Colchester means things like this. There are 40,000 children living in Colchester, 25% of whom live below the poverty line, which is 10,000, which is the same capacity as Colchester United football stadium, which is a sort of graphic image that I use quite a lot, so especially when I'm talking in Colchester about problem, because I don't necessarily not able to visualise it. Everybody in Colchester knows the football stadium, so it's a real clear image of the scale of the problem. All of those figures are pre-COVID. Rachel and I happened to be sitting in my restaurant when we were having this conversation, my cafe, and I'd actually closed the cafe in about week 1 or 2 of starting the job, because it was losing me £40,000 a year just by being a really badly thought out restaurant in a gallery at the far end of a high street in Colchester. The restaurant was originally meant to be a lobster restaurant. That's what it was intended for, which I found out over the course of doing the Holiday Fund project. So this idea that it was a lobster restaurant, for me, symbolised how far away this one organisation was from what was happening on the ground in the town in which it had been built inside the homes of the people that had paid for it. A very big gap in reality check for lots of people. So Rachel and I were sitting in the restaurant, and we just thought, well, let's set up a school canteen, as you do. And we used the tiny blob of £2,000 to do a school holiday, the first school holiday in 2017. And we had loads of volunteers, had all sorts of people got involved. We had the mayor came down and peeled a load of potatoes for a weekend with me, and we just got stuck in. Everybody got involved in making this thing happen. And we designed what is now called the Holiday Fund programme. And that is, in its bare essentials, the Holiday Fund programme consists of 3 types of activity in one day, all provided for free, all for children and their families. And they are particularly children and families who would usually receive a free school meal or are in that bracket around the free school meals mark. And those activities include coming in the morning and doing some sport, which was run by Colchester United Football Club, because I told them the terrible numbers and they wanted to get involved. Then everybody sits down for a meal, which is cooked on site, really good, nutritious meal cooked on site, and everybody sits together. Even with even in COVID rules, we've kept everybody together in the same place. It's all spaced out, very safe now, but it's about being together and eating together. And then all day, every day, people can take part in really, really easy, free art activities that connect directly to the programme. Over the time that we've been running the project, those 3 elements are based on the NHS's 5 ways to wellbeing. And if you do, they are to connect with other people, to eat well, to move around, get your blood going, to observe and spend time looking and thinking about things, and to give time and to learn something. So all of these essential ingredients, if you like, if you did all of those things every day, in general, your well-being will go up, and it's a measurable strategy. So we put all of those things into that free day out for children and their families. Since running the programme over the last however many years that is, since 2017, we've now given away 11,543 meals in total, and more than 7,000 of those have been in the last 7 months. So there's been this enormous uptick in the number of meals that we've provided, and there have been over 40,000 individual participations in the programme in that time. So if each individual activity was ticketed, and you had to buy a ticket or book a ticket for each thing that you did. So if it's one meal or one child going to a bit of sport, or one child taking part in the art activities, if that was a ticketed programme, that would have been more than 40,000 tickets. So we try and measure things in that way and kind of get a sense of how much involvement people are taking. So that's all, in the majority, that's families who've never set foot in not just First Sight, but any other gallery or museum ever. So for us, this is a really incredible way to bring people across our quite terrifying golden banana shaped threshold, which is very off-putting for people. Gradually that interaction deepens. The first interaction is literally run in, get a meal, get out quick, and people don't want to talk. Over time, and we've had some families that have been coming in for every school holiday throughout that period, over time, gradually we make relationships with people, and some of those families are now involved in co-curating exhibitions with us through our Arts Council collection programme. So this is a very soft audience engagement process of bringing people in, looking at need first, offering something in return, building trust, and then gradually getting back to our core purpose, which is about introducing people to art. And then that purpose then having impact, and the impact that that's having on these families is about health, it's about being involved in community, it's about the beginnings of self-expression, it's about confidence building. In the very long run, we think this will lead to changes in employment for people who are involved in the programme for families, improvement in education for those children, all sorts of other tangible, measurable outcomes will come from this programme, but it's a very slow project. We're looking at it over a 15 to 20 year timeline now, having done it just for one school holiday. So it's growing rapidly. It's also the impact on First Sight is it's really shown us how we can be different as a gallery. Meeting these families firsthand in the building and listening to their stories means that they are entirely, it's impossible to ignore what they're saying. We have to listen. You just can't. You can't ignore what they're saying, and we then have to take the next step to do whatever is next in their world that it is that we can help with. And in doing that, we are gradually changing the whole of First Sight. The atmosphere around this project is one where people are in the building. It sounds and looks completely and utterly different. The staff are more upbeat and excited about what we're doing. Our sort of core audiences get what we do in a completely new way. Donations go up, everything starts to change. It's incredibly positive. Second project, Artists Weather Home, is activity packs. So the reason why I start with Holiday Fun is that's a programme that we've been running for 4 years, but it's a programme that is basically about responding to need and bringing creativity to whatever that need is. And if you start there, you can do all sorts of really extraordinary things very, very quickly. And people, you get trust, you build social capital, and all sorts of magic starts to happen from doing that. So when we shut the building at the beginning of lockdown 1, the first Sight question really was, what do people need now? It was quite straightforward. And in my head, I was like, I think they probably need what we do in the building, but at home, because they can't get into the building anymore. But really basic maths. How do we do that? How do we get brilliant art to everybody, wherever they are, whoever they are, perhaps not even having met those people before? And I'd had this idea to do a colouring in book for a long time, and that idea had come out of conversations with families from the Holiday Fun programme. And I've always wanted to take this step of going into people's homes, because we know that there are millions of hurdles to people even coming in for a free meal at First Sight. There are families who can't afford the £5.50 bus fare to get across town to get a free meal. So there's millions of hurdles already anyway. It's not enough to just do a free meal. It doesn't work. How do you actually then get stuff out to people, and how can you bring that sort of well-beingness right there into people's houses or wherever they happen to be? So I'd been thinking about that anyway for a while, and the lockdown happened. I thought, right, let's just try it. Let's just do it. And it was incredibly basic. I over the years, have met lots of artists, so have my team. We emailed them all, and it was very straightforward question. Can you send us an idea that could be described on one page of A4 that we can just shove into a really simple PDF that can be downloaded from our website? The idea needs to be something that people could make at home with very basic or no materials whatsoever. What would you do? And we just asked everybody. And we started with a few people that we just worked with recently. We just finished a show with Anthony Gormley. So he was the first person that I emailed, luckily for me. And he came back within half an hour saying, yes, and here's my idea. So it just sort of spiraled like that. And it just took off pretty much overnight. The other artists, there were about 50 or 60 artists in total. You've got people like Harold Offe, Mark Wallinger, Grayson Perry, Lucy Gunning, Susan Poisson-Locke, all sorts of people, literally address book, empty it out, stick it into a PDF full of ideas. We did 4 packs in the end. The 4th one was this one, which was background to wellbeing, which is the Feel Good activity pack. And this was the most downloaded one. This was in lockdown 2, I think. So when everyone was starting to feel the effects of several lockdowns and opening and closing and on and off, and all of this uncertainty was really kicking in. From the Art is Where the Home Is activity packs came the Great Big Art Exhibition, and that was lockdown 3, January. This was a bright idea I had, having drunk too many clementinis on my birthday in January. And I thought, well, we should carry on doing more packs, but let's do it with more people. Let's get all the museums involved. And really, More Bad Maths by Sally. And I was chatting to somebody who'd got interested in the activity packs, who happens to have a lot of really brilliant connections with some really major people at museums that I don't have. And they very kindly shared their address book because we were doing this thing and they got it. So I was able to contact all the big national museums and ask them to contribute artworks that would be in this pack. And these were recommendations from all the museum directors, so all the kind of fancy big names. We also had lots of new artists designing new ideas that would go into a pack. But with the Great Big Art Exhibition, the idea is that you would make your artwork at home, but you would show it in your window so that we could create a big exhibition all up and down the country. And it's just out there. It's a bit like the NHS Rainbows, but it's kind of the art equivalent. So we did that. We got everybody involved. Thousands of people made artworks. How many minutes have I got? You're looking at.
Oh, we're needing to wrap up, Sally. Sorry. Do you want to make your last couple of points, please?
Fine. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I will. I'm very close to finishing anyway. We then collaborated with Clear Channel. We picked 10 of the artworks that were made, and Clear Channel shared those artworks on their digital screens. And they're up and down the country, and that has an audience. Those screens have an audience of 140 million people in a 2-week period. So I love this idea that you'd make something at home, squish it all together, put it in your window, and then eventually it might get shown to 140 million people across the UK. But that all just was glued together, different relationships and things happening. The impact for us, one of the impacts was this, which was our online subscribers. This is the beginning of lockdown, where it would take me 3 years to get to 11,000 subscribers to our email. That was the first activity pack going out, straight up to 41,000 over a 2-week period, pretty much stayed very high. And then there's another big spike, which is the Great Big Art Exhibition at the end. All those audiences have stayed with us. They've not gone away. That's translated to a 15% uptake in footfall in the gallery since we've reopened. It's also doubled the things like our ethnic diversity of our footfall in the gallery. So all of that work has totally and utterly transformed the relationship around First Sight, completely and utterly from where we were. So there you go. That's it. My last slide.
Thank you, Sally. Sorry to interrupt. It's fascinating. I remember I had a work trip to Colchester. It must have been 2010, thinking about when you opened, because First Sight was a building site. And I remember having the spiel about it being this very grand intervention in Colchester. So it's fascinating to hear about the path of it becoming something so socially relevant. And it feels like a kind of story of our times in that sense. So we're going to take some questions. We've had a couple in the chat, but please do post some more, everybody. We're going to take questions after our next speaker, who is Sharondeep Jawanda. Sharondeep leads the community engagement programme at the East End Women's Museum, and her role is really about building those relationships with local partners and organisations to make sure their voices get into the museum development and the building. So over to you, Sharondeep.
Thank you, Sally. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully I can do this. Can everyone see that? Yes, okay, I can see some people nodding, which is great. Brilliant. So hi everyone, I'm Sharon. I'm a 30-year-old cis woman with short brown hair, and I'm wearing a black polo neck. My pronouns are she and her. I'm East London based, and I've worked in learning and engagement for about 10 years now. And I only started as community engagement lead at East End Women's Museum in March this year. But I'm excited to join you today to tell you all about our work as well. I'm going to start by quickly telling you a little bit about the East End Women's Museum. We record, share and celebrate stories of East London women, both past and present. And we are the only dedicated women's museum in England. The museum seeks to better represent hidden lives, challenge gender inequalities and stereotypes, and empower women and girls to share their stories and find their own voice. We began back in 2015 when a supposed women's museum on Cable Street opened as a Jack the Ripper museum instead, distressingly glorifying violence against women. And rather than allowing women's voices to yet again be sidelined in history, our founders set up the East End Women's Museum. So I'm just gonna click on to, I hope you can see the next picture. Yep, brilliant. Since then, we have existed as a pop-up, mobile and virtual museum. We have been popping up at protests, pie shops, libraries, markets and more, hosting events, activities and exhibitions as well. In 2018, we had some amazing news from Barking and Dagenham Council. They were going to offer us a new space to create a physical home for our museum in Barking. And we are now getting incredibly excited about opening our museum building towards the end of 2022. And in the meantime, we are still very much a mobile pop-up virtual museum. The image on the screen is of the design plan for the museum created by our architects, Manolo and White. And we are a predominantly women-led design and consultant team with only one token man. And we're hoping that we can translate this to the construction side of things as well. And we've been told that if we manage to get an all-women construction team, it will be the first, or a majority women construction team as well, it will be the first project in the world to accomplish this. So we are going to give it a really good go to make sure we are designed and fitted out by women. So looking at the design plan, it is a small museum. The permanent exhibition space will introduce key themes, telling stories of women as campaigners, carers, sports stars, artists, inventors, rebels, and much, much more. And then temporary exhibitions will enable us to sort of delve deeper into subjects, and the first of which will be on women's activism. There will also be opportunities for visitors to share their own stories. So we're actively recording women and girls' voices for the future as well. The space will be brought further to life through a wide range of activities, including family fun days, creative workshops, panel debates, school sessions, community socials. We hope to get lots of communities coming in and using the space as well, under 5 sessions and more. There will also be digital technology in the space to enable us to live stream events to those who can't make it to Barking and indeed around the world as well. So to get this far, we've consulted with thousands of people across East London, from families and schools to young people and older women's groups. We are a very tiny charity working with limited resources, but building relationships with communities is really important to us. We are a small team with 3 members of staff, a board of trustees and a team of volunteers. Over the last year, our engagement work has specifically focused on co-designing the new building and sort of raising awareness of the museum locally in Barking and Dagenham and neighbouring Newham. And just to give you some facts about Barking and Dagenham, it has one of the lowest levels of cultural engagement in the country. There are high rates of domestic violence. There are many different languages spoken in the borough as well. And both Barking and Dagenham and Newham are priority places for Arts Council England as well. So we've held lots of different events. We've had town hall events, both in person and virtually, where we have discussed the layout, the facilities available in the space, and the palette as well, and then also showing examples of materials that we might potentially use in the space. We've also had tea parties for local women, using tea and cake to bring women together to have a chat, not just about the museum, but also about shared experiences as well. And I'm just going to share a photo of that as well. As we don't have the museum space at the moment, we are very much going into other local venues, such as local libraries and church halls as well. So we're always trying to find new spaces locally that people can easily access and get to, so that more and more people will come and engage with our work. At the moment, our work doesn't always end up in something tangible. We are more focused on building relationships and trust. For example, earlier this year, I went to a local women's centre and spent a few hours playing badminton with a couple of ladies, and I didn't play very well, but it was still a lot of fun to just spend that time with them, talk a bit about the museum, but also get involved in their activities. We've had a collaborative ethos from the start. We've always worked with partners to create pop-up events and exhibitions that have engaged and inspired diverse audiences. And we'll continue to sort of build on these relationships and develop new partnerships as we go into the future as well. So I'm going to quickly tell you about some of our co-curated exhibitions that have taken place, and then move into some of the work that I've done over the last couple of months as well. So in 2018-2019, we celebrated the economic, cultural and political contributions of women factory workers in the 20th century, and explored changing ideas about the proper place for women in our Working for Equality project. And this was supported by National Lottery Heritage Fund and Eastside Community Heritage. We created a mobile exhibition. We put on a range of accessible public events, ran workshops with local schools, led reminiscence sessions with older women, and collected fascinating oral histories from local women who work in factories before 1968. We took the travelling exhibition to community venues, libraries and festivals. So we were really going out into the community with the exhibition, and 8 local volunteers helped shape the exhibition, and they received training in oral history, archive research, heritage interpretation and presentation skills. And the community volunteers did all the research. They decided what was going to be displayed in the exhibition, and also how it was shared with the public as well. So you can see in this photograph the exhibition touring to local public space and some of our volunteers as well. And as part of this project, we also worked with Barking and Dagenham Youth Dance to develop a dance for local teenagers, and they performed that piece at a Votes for Women garden party. And a further partnership with another youth organisation, the Arc Theatre based in Barking and Dagenham. They did a drama performance about women in the workplace. And this project overall engaged about 6,000 people throughout the 2018-2019 period. On a similar budget, on a smaller budget, I should say, we took a similar approach with our Making Her Mark exhibition, which was created in collaboration with Hackney Museum and Hackney Archives. And this told the story of women-led activism in Hackney from 1918 to the present day. And curation of this exhibition was led by Community Advisory Panel, who challenged us to uncover hidden stories of women who have changed society from a wide variety of backgrounds, and often despite numerous disadvantages. And this exhibition, we had 8,500 visitors to the exhibition. And you can find out about both of these exhibitions on our website, or more about the exhibition and the stories that were collected as well. During lockdown, we ran an online project called Let's See the Invisible, which was artist responses to the East End Women's Museum. Supported using public funding from Arts Council England, we commissioned 6 local artists to reflect on the importance and future of East End Women's Museum. The micro-commissions asked artists to consider questions such as, what does the museum mean to its local community? Why do we need a women's museum of East London? Which story should be featured in the museum building? So as part of developing this work, artists connected virtually with their own networks. Together, the group explored these questions, bringing together different perspectives and ideas to the commissions. The finished commissions are available to also view on our website, so please do have a look. I'm going to read one short piece written by poet Sonia Quintero, who worked alongside women from two groups that they run. One a creative writing refugees group and another a female-only poetry group. They are not the answer, you are not the answer. I am not the answer, we are the answer. So really powerful work. As mentioned, a lot of our work recently has been about getting to know our local audiences. So we received some funding from the London Community Response Fund, which was for the museum's development through community-centred work. We reached out to and met with community groups across Barking and Dagenham, fostering relationships with those local to the new museum, from mums at a toddler group to a women's community group at a local mosque. Just sharing another photo there. These conversations were centred around community needs and interests and how the museum and other local organisations can meet them. And we were able to have meaningful conversations in really small groups. So the first photograph is of me chatting to some mums with their toddlers about the museum, about what they want from the local community, what's missing in the local community, how the museum can support them. And then the second photograph is from some access and inclusion workshops that we ran, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So with the community, London Community Response Fund, the project sort of started at the beginning of spring when most groups weren't running or meeting in person. So we virtually worked with 10 young people from 4 local youth groups, and they received training from British Youth Council that led to them leading discussions with their peers and networks. So 10 young people led their discussions and then they collated and presented their findings to local organisations on an online Zoom call. We really valued all the time and contributions from all the people that we spoke to during this project. So we were able to provide them with some honorarium, which included vouchers, which we asked them which ones they would prefer, and some books for the toddlers as well. We used some of the community response funding to run 2 access and inclusion workshops with Disordinary Architecture and some disabled artists as well. Disordinary Architecture worked with groups to co-create new and exciting ways to do disability differently in the co-design of buildings. There were about 30 participants across the 2 workshops. One of the workshops was in person at the Barbican and the other was online. And there were BSR interpreters present at both workshops, and the workshop leaders audio described all the visual elements as well. We advertised these workshops to relevant organisations through Disordinary Architectures networks and through the Barbican as well. In the first workshop, we sort of thought about ways an object can be displayed and interpreted. And in the second workshop, we looked at the East End Women's Museum as a virtual museum and how we can make our online presence more accessible. Moving on, I'm going to talk about our steering group. So in 2019, 17 volunteers were recruited to form a steering group to help support the development of the museum and act as community champions. This group of local women from diverse backgrounds across East London enabled the museum to work with around 1,700 people across the community to ask them what they wanted from the new museum building, its contents and its facilities. Together, we also commissioned artists to co-develop creative consultation workshops, which were delivered by the steering group to their networks and schools and community groups, and also at festivals as well. We continue to work with and consult with the steering group today. They are now a group of 24 East London women, and I'm showing a photo here of us at a Zoom meeting, just having a lovely chat with some of those ladies. Earlier this year, we ran a project with our architects, which was an emotive creative workshop, asking the members of the steering group to present an object that was important to them. And this activity got us thinking about how we would collect and display personal objects in the museum and how we could present them as well. So what kind of description would we give them? just following on from what Sandra and Harry said this morning, we want to increase our representation of Black women in the museum as well. So I would love to talk to Sandra and Harry about this further, about how we can work towards achieving that goal. We are also currently looking towards a volunteer-led community talks programme to spread the word about the museum. We don't envision much input in terms of our time and money, but we know that this could be scalable and sustainable. We very much want to value and harness our volunteers' time and networks, and also their interests as well. So we provide them with training that can support them in the work that they want to do. And we are really keen to embed volunteer perspectives in our work and leverage their contributions as well, which is why they've been involved in our capital project quite a bit, and we regularly update them on the work and get them involved in the work that we're doing as well. Just going to share next photo. Yeah. We don't have lots of resources, so we are always looking to use existing local assets to support us in engaging with communities and building relationships. The conception of our work is different to a traditional museum. We collapse hierarchies by meeting people where they are, and this ethos will continue once we've got our building open as well. So as you can see from this photograph, we have had stalls and workshops at local festivals and events across East London, and we are always happy to pop up at events with aligned interests to chat about the museum and share our designs as well. We proactively reach out to hard to reach community groups, and we ask if we can come along to their sessions or venues to speak about the museum, or we get asked to deliver talks to groups as well. I've had lively chats over cups of chai and samosas with the South Asian ladies group that meets in a local church, and it's just really great turning up into their sessions and just having a chat with them, and they feel really relaxed and comfortable because it's a space that they're familiar with. We also use local Facebook groups and local online platforms to advertise and share the work that we're doing. I've also written an article about the museum for a local newsletter, which gets sent out to about 16,000 homes in Barking. I'm currently speaking to the community champion at Asda in Barking about how we can collaborate, perhaps by having a stall in the store, a coffee morning, or by having our designs on display in the store as well. And all of this work is really paying off. When I first started speaking to people locally about the museum, many people didn't know about us. They hadn't heard about the East End Women's Museum. But at the end of October, I had a stall in Barking Market, and the majority of people who came along had said, "Oh yeah, we've heard about you," and they were asking about when the museum would open as well, which was really great. So these are some of the examples of how we have worked with local communities so far. Of course, we're not finished with this work yet. This engagement work will continue over the next year in the lead up to opening and beyond. And I'm hoping that we can, over the next year, activate a space in Barking while the museum is being fit out, so that we can continue engagement with people locally. And once open, we are very keen to ensure that all of our programmes and exhibitions are led and developed with local community partners as well. The last slide I am going to share with you is just two more detailed illustrations of the museum showing people in the museum space, and these were also done by our architects. We are very keen that this museum is a very welcoming space, and we also want to ensure that it's a resource to women locally as well. So they'll come in, they'll find out a lot about what's happening locally, where they can access support and resources, and also putting on talks that are relevant to them as well. And I've also included our social media handles and all our contact details, so I'll put those in the chat as well. So please do feel free to get in touch. I'm going to say thank you. We look forward to welcome you to the museum soon, and I'm going to hand back over to Sally.
Thank you, Sharon Deep.
Sorry, I talk really fast, so I hope that was okay.
I do too. So yeah, it made perfect sense to me. We've had a load of questions come in as the two of you were talking. So I think I will try and plough straight into some of those. But at the same time, if in the audience you would like to ask a question yourself, then hopefully it will work for you to use the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and raise your hand that way, because then I think you'll come to the top of the list and I'll see you to invite you to talk. So let's give that a go. But while we see if it works, let me ask you some questions that have come up in the chat. Sharondeep, just reflecting on what you've just said, there's quite a thorny issue that comes up about paying participants, and I wondered if you'd both like to reflect on that. It's something that comes up a lot in the projects we support through the Collections Fund, and I know it might be a luxury to some people to think about paying, but there are lots of ethics in that. Sharondeep, should we come to you first?
Yes, so when we've got funded projects, we do always try to ensure that participants get some kind of honorarium or are paid for their time. That we think that's really important. When we work with artists, we will always pay them for their time as well. With volunteers, again, as I mentioned, we are very keen that they are very keen to work with us, and they've got loads of resources and networks that we want to tap into, and we just want to ensure that their sort of contributions are recognised by the museum, and we also leverage sort of their voices in the museum space as well. So it's not always possible for us to pay volunteers for their time or pay participants for their time, but when we can, we do try to.
Sally, do you have a policy on it or an approach that you take?
Yeah, we always. Oh, sorry, was that to me?
Yes, it was. We've got a little bit of a delay, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. We always pay with the Artists with a Homes activity pack. We offered everybody a fee, but not everyone took it. So it depends on the artists and where they are in their world, but it's always offered. And we try and we've tried kind of turned it around so that the more emerging you are as an artist, the more we try and pay you. And it sort of seems to then trickle down to the other end of the scale, where you've got somebody like Anthony, and whatever we could pay wouldn't make much of a difference to him. So he's very generous and just says, "Don't worry about it, I'll just do it." And it's part of his contribution. So it sort of depends on the context, but absolutely, it's always offered 100%. And so, and the same with any co-curation that we do. There's always a fee there too.
Wonderful. Claire Frampton, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? Let's see if this works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I was fascinated by the last presentation. I just wanted to ask about at the beginning of the presentation, the speaker mentioned about Jack the Ripper Museum, and I was a bit shocked about. I didn't quite understand the connection to the Women's Museum. Was it the space was going to be the Women's Museum, and then it was taken over by the Jack the Ripper Museum? It's just sorry, I know that was at the beginning of the speak. It painted quite a bleak picture.
It really does. The people that were involved with the original, what was supposed to be the East End Women's Museum, presented the idea to Tower Hamlets Council, and it was all about women's history, women's activism locally. And then I don't know how it happened, but somehow when it opened as the Jack the Ripper Museum. So it was the people that were in who put through all the plans. They had decided instead to open a Jack the Ripper Museum instead of the East End Women's Museum. It wasn't that someone else came in and took over the project or anything. It was just they changed their outlook on what the project was going to be.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay.
Thanks, Claire and Sharondeep. There were some other really meaty issues that came up in the questions in the chat, and one of those was about advocacy and the kind of the key phrases and the policies that you appeal to be persuasive about participatory practice. And then the other one was about measuring impact, particularly after your talk, Sally, talking about measuring impact over that long period of time. Sally, perhaps we'll come to you first, if you can reflect on those two issues.
Yeah, the advocacy one's really interesting. I found in many situations, not just with First Sight, that it's much better to show somebody something than to tell them. You can say as much as you like, and words tend to land on very deaf ears, and it's quite frustrating. But as soon as you put something even a small example in front of people and let them see it for themselves, you just see conviction happening in front of you. And the other thing that I've done a lot of with First Sight is it's much better not coming from me as a museum director. It's much better if I can invite Maria Wilby from Refugee Action just to come with me to a meeting with Essex County Council and say, listen to Maria, and I'm just going to say nothing because I can't share this stuff properly for you. Maria will tell you what is exactly happening in these people's lives, and then I'll step back in and say, this is how we're working together and this is what you need to do to contribute, by which time they're usually totally and utterly focused on what is happening. If you can bring that that authentic urgency into the room, people will pay attention. And the other thing is about having really wonderful ideas. Start with the idea, don't start with the budget, because the budget may or may not happen. Start with a really fantastic idea and push it as far as you possibly can. And then things tend to gather around really wonderful ideas. The other thing that I learned early doors as a student, trying to make things happen when nobody knew who the hell I was and I had no contacts. So this is partly an answer to Louisa's question about no one knowing you and how do you start. It is about ideas, and the more you concentrate on what it is that you're trying to do, why it's going to make a difference and to whom, and that full story, including the impact and why that impact is important, the more people gather around you and the more enthusiasm and energy grows. And it's a very human thing, this way of working, and people are attracted to energy and something beginning to happen and positivity. And that's the thing to focus on. And then gradually what starts to happen is money comes into the room, other resources. Quite often, money isn't the thing that's stopping your project from happening, it's something else. I tend to talk about resources and what you need to make your idea happen. So the idea of the mayor coming down and peeling potatoes, I could have worked really hard to raise the money to pay an agency staff member to peel the potatoes for me, or I can invite people in and say, I need some help. It's not going to happen without everybody helping. Go and help me, please. And appeal to people's nature and the cause and let people into it and see how far you can go without spending any money. It's really interesting. You can actually go a very, very long way. And then sometimes you do need to pay artists, and you can't pay them in goodwill. They can't eat goodwill. So there are moments where you do need money, but then it's not so much because you've actually realised all these other things through a different way. So that's a little bit about advocacy. And then what was the second question?
The second question was about measuring impact, particularly thinking long term. The longer term you think, the more clearer the type of impact you can have becomes. So you might be able to see it, you won't be able to see it in detail. This thing here on my wall is a really weird diagram of the next 65 years. And a few years ago, I started searching on the jolly internet, so I'm not sure how accurate that diagram is, but I was looking for sort of forecasts of big things that might impact on the human race in general over the next 65 years, because I was sort of fed up of we were in this real short-term trap at First Sight. Everything was about 2 weeks away from disaster, and we had to get out of that mindset and start looking much further down the line, because it was something else causing me real anxiety and stress. So I started looking really far down the line into the future. So there's loads of trends on that diagram. And one of the biggest trends is about mental health. One of the other big trends is about a virus, but it actually talks about a computer virus or a technological virus, not a human virus. And then the impact of technological change on the employment market, and then the knock-on effects on mental health. So these really big subjects, they don't go away ever. So that's what I'm trying to hook on to, is those big subjects. That then comes back to evaluation, because then really what I'm trying to do is prove a point about creativity and culture. That's my personal main project, is to say this is a really vital thing that we human beings do. It makes a difference to the way that we are human beings. We can be better human beings with great culture in our lives for all of these reasons. So I've got my long-term story there as well, which helps me then boil back down to what do I need to measure
and how best do I do that, and how can I then track that change, preferably over a really long time. So when you're running a program that's about giving away free meals, you shouldn't be doing, I mean, you should do it for 2 weeks, because even 2 weeks is a good thing. But ideally, you'd be looking to do that for an entire generation, which is possibly how long it might take for Colchester's poverty situation or deprivation situation to change, or maybe even longer. And that just helps you boil back down to the real things that you should be measuring, which is sort of an evaluation answer. Sorry, I tend to kind of go to the bigger end of the scale of things. I don't know why.
It's the perspective we need. Sharon-Dee, would you like to reflect on those same issues? Because you're at the other end of it, aren't you, as you're building your museum?
Yeah, so just starting with the impact, as I've already mentioned, we are very much not focused on tangible outcomes at the moment. So with the building project, we wanted to get people involved in that and have conversations with them about what they want in the space. And then with all the community work that I'm doing now, just to get the word out about the museum, it's more just about getting the word out, talking to people about the museum, ensuring they know about us and that they can feed back to me about things that we might not have considered. So it's about having conversations with local community members. So that's the first part. Sorry, the second part. With the first part is sort of advocacy, we work in partnership a lot of the time. So as you heard through my presentation, we worked with a lot of partners on some of our big major projects, and that's so that we are using the resources that we might not have ourselves, but also tapping into the local communities that are based around East London through other local organisations.
Well, do either of you, it's a bit of a tangential question, but do either of you find there are local government frameworks or different authority funders frameworks that you feel you need to slot into? And are they useful, I guess is my question. Just in the context of, if we're talking about 65 years of change, then what do we need to match to in the short term?
I found that as soon as I did start thinking 65 years and more, I felt more useful to those people, because those statutory bodies are built over many hundreds of years anyway, and they are rightly thinking in those timeframes too. So it's enabled me to at least fit my conversation to their conversation, and they're usually quite surprised. They're a bit like, wow, you're like a gallery that thinks into the future. Weird. So that's always quite good. It's like, oh, okay, you can talk. But it's opened up other pots of money. So a lot of the support that we've had for the Holiday Fund programmes actually come from the NHS. And most of my time with First Sight in particular has been around completely different non-art funding to do a really big art project, because we're talking about impact and we're talking about change on the ground. We're talking about community difference and social impact and social capital. And there are many other people more interested in that than they are about talking about art and cultural funding. And cultural funding is dwindling anyway, the competition is crazy. But the more I demonstrate what I'm adding to their bigger, longer term project from a completely different angle, the more excited they are. So the NHS see us as a real kind of experimentation centre for their ideas. They can test stuff out through my art gallery, because we're all about weird ideas. And that's fantastic, because they're not allowed to, because they're hospitals and whatever. It just changes the landscape of who you can talk to.
Lovely. Do remember, if you're in the audience, you can raise your hand and ask a question directly. Going back to some of the ones we had in the chat, I mean, you've partly answered these, but there are some nuts and bolts questions that came in from Beth and Naomi about how at the East End Women's Museum you've recruited your community advisory panel and how you go about training volunteers. So I wonder if you can draw out some of those points.
Sorry, I think you mean me, yeah?
Yes, I do, yes.
So, yeah, great. Yes, so with our steering group, we did an open call out locally across East London, using, again, other local organisations through things like we've got at Barking and Dagenham, we've got a voluntary service, and we posted things on there. We posted on our social media, we posted on our website, and then we posted to other local organisations as well. And then we've used things like Museum Detox and things to share some of our roles and things as well. And in terms of sort of for like project work, I've tended to get in touch with community groups and see if they're interested in working with us. And it's just then that starts the conversation, and we start having conversations, start building something. With our co-created exhibitions, we again relied on our partners and the kind of groups that they already work with in the local community.
Right.
So it's very much very locally based, and just spreading the word through local organisations, charities and social enterprises.
And how did you, each of you, if you look back, how did you start before you did have the contact book? Thinking about that earlier question in the chat. Is it just as simple as pick someone and pick up the phone? Or is there more of an art to it?
Firstly, it's a lot about aligned interests. So we do specifically target women's groups or women's centres, or specific groups and communities that exist that align with our own interests and our aims as well. And then, yeah, most of the time I just send an email, or I say I'll give you a call, and we just have a chat about the museum.
Is it similar for you, Sally? There was a question earlier about how you went about publicising some of your art packs and things like that. How do you get the word out? And on the flip side of that, before you know people, how do you start to do that work?
Yeah, there's been lots of moments where I've not known people, or people haven't wanted to know me. People that I did know all of a sudden just weren't there. So when you go into a failing art gallery, it's surprising who doesn't reply. And then some people do, so that's, you know, worth mentioning. It's really hard to answer this one. What did I do first? I think it comes back to having ideas that you believe in, but you can draw that line from your idea into somebody else's reality, if that makes any sense. And knowing what it is that's important about what you're doing. This whole point about purpose is really critical. If you don't have that really locked down, it becomes very difficult to translate anything that you're doing to anybody else. I love artworks like the one that Mark Wallinger did for the activity pack. He was talking about communication. The most basic communication isn't a word and a language, it's just a hand waving. So like, how do you boil things down to the most simple thing that you can possibly boil it down to, which is really hard and has taken me a long time to kind of realize that that's the most important thing to do. But it's about that, and then from that comes an enormous amount of passion and energy that I think also people pick up on. The NHS conversation took me about 2 years to get the first bit of money, and that came from a conversation that I had really early on. I happened to be in a meeting. I got invited to a very random meeting, and at the beginning I was just going to all these random meetings because I didn't know anything or anyone. I was just going to everything, being like this happy puppy, like, hi everyone. And I ended up sitting next to a guy who had just been to the hospital, and we'd both started on exactly the same day, and we were having this hilarious chat about who was going to get sacked first. And that just opened a conversation that then carried on for about a year, just back and forth chatting about, oh, you're still there, well done, you know, making little connections with people. And eventually it was him who went into the funding level at the top and totally championed my project. There's no way in hell I would have got that money otherwise, but it's just about making friends with people and being out there and making yourself vulnerable. It's really nerve-wracking, but you just got to stick yourself out there and somebody will reply. Someone, it may not be who you expect, but someone will come back, and it might take a little bit of time as well. You've got to let it play out. You've got to be patient, but things do happen.
Yeah, I agree with what Sally just said. It is, you do have to just put yourself out there, and yeah, you won't always hear back, but keep trying.
That's such a positive point to end on. I think we're gonna wrap up there for this session and go into our lunch break, a well-deserved lunch break. So we will join together back again at 2 o'clock to start the afternoon session. I think Rebecca's gonna pause this so you can leave your screen open and then come back to us at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, both of you. It was a really inspiring session. Yeah, more this afternoon, everyone. See you later.
Thanks, bye.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've managed a decent break over lunch and you're ready to get stuck in again. We've had a really refreshing set of talks so far today, ranging from purpose and values to what makes an equal partnership, to getting out there and making friends with people whose interests align with our own. Thanks as well to everyone who's posting in the comments. Please do let us know what you're agreeing with as you hear from our speakers and what you want to hear more about. We've got a session now this afternoon about breaking down barriers and championing new practice, and we've got 4 speakers to hear from. So each person's going to talk for about 15 minutes and then we will open up for questions. So we'll just get straight into it. I'd like to welcome first of all our first speaker, Victoria Rives, who manages Heritage Doncaster's History, Health and Happiness programme. It's a great name, that uses storytelling and objects to tackle isolation and to improve wellbeing. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. I'm just going to do the really awkward tackling technology bit. Okay. Can you see the screen? That's all worked fine? Yeah, brilliant. So what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes is I'm going to introduce History, Health and Happiness to you. And then I'm going to end my presentation with a couple of things to think about, or dare we say provocations around barriers to engagement. So History, Health and Happiness is a programme of wellbeing activities that take place in 4 communities in Doncaster. The work's funded by Arts Council England and it is part of Heritage Doncaster, which is the local authority run heritage organisations in Doncaster. Our activities aim to use history and storytelling to spark conversation, improve wellbeing and tackle isolation. So simply put, we use history to enable people to feel good about themselves and their communities. We work with a mix of vulnerable and isolated adults, families and young people. And our sessions are delivered in collaboration with other organisations and charities, but also independently as well. The key thing about the sessions is they all take place in spaces that aren't the museums. They all take place outside of our museum, in places like libraries, community halls, family hubs, any social space that will have us really. We're really keen to anchor ourselves as part of those communities that we work in, and we evaluate our work really robustly. So in order to advocate for an Arts on Prescription scheme for Doncaster, our work is evaluated on an ongoing basis by Sheffield Hallam University. All of our sessions have co-production at their heart and they respond to the needs and wants of the audiences we work with. So we began activities in August of 2019 and we focus primarily on 3 types of activity. We focus on, firstly, social clubs and outreach, and this includes weekly social club activities. The picture that's on the screen is a bunch of women that meet on a weekly basis in Dennerby, Maine, which is a former pit village. And we get together every week to explore the stories of women in the past and work out what we think of them, basically. The second part of our work is partnerships. They're a big part of our programme, and we partner with third sector organisations, other council teams and other MPOs in Doncaster. And our partnerships are really key because they help us to share resource, share learning and to constantly develop. We're a small team, we're a team of 4, so the more we can partner, the more we can do. And the third strand of our work is community exhibitions. During the pandemic, we adapted our programming. And another part of our offer is we offer regular digital social clubs and also offline activities that we send via post. So I said that in order to advocate for the power of our work, we work with academics to evaluate the impact of the programme on wellbeing and mental health. We collect a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. It's really important for us to collect the data, as although commissioners, health teams and the local authority understood that culture could improve wellbeing, they were really keen for local examples. So this academic data enables me to strongly advocate for the value of what we do. And this advocacy is vital for ensuring the sustainability of the work and helping us to seek out alternate funding streams. On the screens, there is an infographic that shows our findings for 2020. I'm not going to read out everything, but one of the really nice things to note on there is that our evaluators concluded that our online groups reached out to the vulnerable and built online communities. They found that for those who attended digital social clubs, the impact of the project was considerable, both in terms of connection, mental health, and increased confidence around computer use. We know that those that attended our digital social clubs in 2020 had a 20% increase in interest in new things, a contributing factor to increased mental health scores. I wanted to use the rest of my time to unpick and kind of discuss three dilemmas that we come up against in the work that we do in Doncaster. So the first thing I wanted to look at was where we work and how we decide where we work. So when History, Health and Happiness was launched, we recognised that with a small team, we needed to pinpoint the areas we were going to work in order to make the most difference. This meant we identified key geographical areas to target our work. Essentially, we work in areas of Doncaster that have the lowest levels of cultural engagement, but highest levels of health challenges, including mental health challenges. To map these areas, we used lots of different data sets. It was, for someone like me that loves stats, it was an incredible nerdy afternoon and I loved it very much. But what it basically meant doing was looking at our joint strategic needs assessments for Doncaster, the cultural survey and our own visitor surveys, and mapping all of this data to work out where we needed to work. However, it's not a perfect science. Our target areas do sometimes need to flex, and this was particularly evident during the pandemic when activities moved online. It meant that geographical postcode areas weren't so important, but in general, the target areas have meant we've been able to get to grips with the communities and really find out what makes them tick. The other thing to note is that History, Health and Happiness deliver all of our activities outside of museum spaces or virtually. When working in person, our activities take place in community halls, youth hubs, libraries, and other public spaces. We select the venues based on their facilities, but also in conjunction with the future participants themselves. For example, Her Story, the women's group I mentioned earlier, first started meeting in the local library, but the group decided they wanted to branch out into trying historical cooking. They needed more access to parking and wanted to be closer to the school so they could pick up their kids and return to the session. So we moved the session. Taking our activities out into the communities addresses some of the things that make museums harder to access. Doncaster is the biggest metropolitan borough in the UK, and this means for some, travel to the town centre in Doncaster isn't easy or even something they do regularly. Bringing activities to people's doorsteps removes the need for those lengthy and costly journeys. It also helps to break down the building fear. The venues we set up in are familiar, comforting, and in lots of cases already known. Some of our sessions take place in local cafes where people would pop in anyway. This has been particularly important when working with our vulnerable audiences and groups that value spaces that are familiar. We've also found that activities being on their turf rather than ours has really helped us to build trust and relationships with the groups, and people have felt much more comfortable being their authentic selves. We have built a good understanding of what each community is like, who their key community anchors are, and what they want. It means that our activities look slightly different in different places across the borough. We haven't just lifted and shifted concepts. There have been some areas though where it's been much harder to establish activities. These are the spaces where these are the locations where there are fewer community spaces, a lack of a high street, and their community anchors are often overly burdened as everyone calls on them for the same favours. For these areas, we focus more on partnership work, delivering in collaboration rather than going out alone. Building these relationships and community knowledge, though, is really time consuming, and it's important not to underestimate the time that this takes. Several months on the ground have been needed to get activity up and running, which isn't always a luxury that all of us can afford. But it has paid off in the longevity of activities. So the Her Story group was founded really early in 2019, and it's survived the pandemic and lots of different iterations, and it's still running. And I don't think that would be the case if we hadn't really got to know the community beforehand. So my advice is that in any activity plan that we write, we need to remember to build in that time for relationship building. Community engagement is a special skill, and it really takes time. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the challenge of saying no. In establishing who we were going to work with, we also had to establish our boundaries. We recognised that we are not art therapists, we're not counsellors or specialist mental health practitioners. And we're clear that we never want to be a replacement for statutory service. As a general rule, we seek to form part of people's recovery from mental health crisis rather than being their first port of call. But this hasn't meant we haven't had to be clued up in where to signpost people, how to talk about mental health, safeguarding, and specific mental health issues. My team have received training in mental health awareness, suicide awareness, and other bits of training that help them along the way. We also make sure that we have regular team debriefs and space to let off steam. I've built budget lines into our budget for self-care and moments of joy. It's vital that we look after the staff that do this wellbeing work, as well as the participants. It's also been really important for us to say no, or more likely, how about we do that later, when our activity diaries have become really full. We want to continue to ensure we give a personalised experience to our groups. We've began to adopt a course model with new project partners, which means we offer a 6-week block of activities, giving us time to continue to offer our weekly social clubs in addition to this. Finding a way to spread the activity has been important in ensuring the sustainability of our programme. Lastly, I wanted to consider partnerships and co-design. History, Health and Happiness is built on partnerships. We couldn't do what we do without our partners. We work with a variety of partners so that we can pool resources, pool staff, and crucially, learn from the expertise of others. When entering a partnership, we seek to set up relationships with organisations that have similar values to ours. For example, being person-centred, creative, and caring. Having similar foundations to the partner organisation helps to establish a relationship that's going to work. Generally, if we are embarking on a particular project with a partner, such as a shared exhibition, we try to write a partnership agreement that outlines who's going to do what. But we found this formal document can be really intimidating for smaller groups or individuals. So we're working on a new document that outlines the activity, our boundaries and values, but doesn't appear so legal or terrifying. That is a massive challenge in the local authority. We strive for all of our partnerships to be mutually beneficial and fulfilling. It is not a partnership if only one side is benefiting. As an organisation, it's useful to identify what you really mean by co-production as well. Is what you mean co-production, or is it collaboration or hosting? How much power are you actually able or willing to give away to a community group or individual? Thinking about this power balance or imbalance is really important. It should affect how you carry out your activities. Some of our partnerships have a fairly even balance of power, especially those where we split the budget, we meet in a neutral venue, and we've devised the outcomes together. But there are some relationships where the power balance leans more heavily in our favour, particularly if we're footing the bill, or if we have control over what space is available or have more defined outputs in mind. Being aware of this power imbalance is really important, especially if a partner or group is giving their time for free. In these circumstances, we've tried to build in more time and allow the activities to be guided by the participants or partner. In practice, this just means spending more time listening. Some of our best work in communities has occurred when we've been able to give over more of the power. This has been easier to do in localities on someone else's turf. We simply just aren't the experts there. This has also meant needing to take risks. I found that sometimes the best things happen when you take a leap of faith. I wanted to end our presentation by bringing it back to what it's all about. One thing that we try and do in our team is to remind ourselves why we do what we do. And the example on the screen is just that. This is a snapshot of a case story from a lady called Marie. Marie joined our digital social clubs last year in the midst of lockdown. And one of the quotes she said is consistently my favorite thing. She said that before she joined the group, she was beginning to lose her sparkle, but her sparkle has come back, and that's down to looking forward to Tuesdays. So I wanted to end on Marie's words as a reminder of the importance of why we do what we do. And that's me.
Thanks so much, Victoria. That's really, it's touched on so many of the issues that came up in the discussions this morning, and it's put a real kind of practical lens on it that I think is really helpful at this stage in the day as we think about applying some of these things in our own museums. We're going to take questions at the end, as I said, so we'll whiz on to the next person. And next up is Paul Finnegan. Paul is the curator at Dartmoor Prison Museum, and that's run by HMP Dartmoor and tells the story of 200 years of, well, one of the most famous prisons in the world. So over to you, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. Hopefully Rebecca's going to run the slideshow for me. Oh, I'm getting a wave.
Sorry, give me one moment. I managed to close it down. So.
Okay. Well, I'll just fill in then. Basically, the Dartmoor Prison Museum, just to give you everyone some kind of context, we are the only museum that's actually run and attached to an operational prison. There are various other crime and punishment museums throughout the country, but the museum itself is funded by the prison service, and myself and my fellow curator are actually employed by the prison service as well. So first slide, just with the context, there's Dartmoor Prison itself from a very old etching. And as you can see, it's in the middle of Dartmoor. And as most people think, in the middle of Dartmoor to keep the worst offenders away from society. But let me just explode a myth. First of all, Dartmoor Prison wasn't actually built as a convict prison. It was actually built as a prisoner of war depot. Early 1800s, we're at war with France, there were Napoleonic Wars. French prisoners were originally being held down in what is today Devonport. They come up with an idea to build a prison somewhere in Devon because disease was an issue, overcrowding was an issue. Regent. And his land manager wanted to develop the land for agriculture. So when they came up with the idea of building a prison in Devon, he said to the prisons, if you can pull a few strings, build this prison in the middle of your farmland, gives us 5,000 men free. He's not here for security reasons, he's actually put here for commercial reasons. So after taking in the French prisoners from 1809, from 1812, if I was at war with America, so from 1813, we took in American prisoners as well. So at its height, there's probably about 12,500 men locked up inside the construction that you can see at the moment. So can you, the next slide, please, Rebecca. So there's always been a history of prisoners' arts and crafts. So on the next slide, you should see some examples we have in the museum of prisoners' arts and crafts, which, there we go. The first one is some dominoes, and they are made of beef bone. And the one next to it is a toothpick, again made of beef bone. So these would have been made by the prisoners, because gambling was a big issue. The toothpick, somebody asked me last week, why would you go to all that much trouble to make a toothpick? Well, the reason is that
Hello, I think we might have lost Paul there. Is it just me, or have we lost him for everybody? Okay, well, let's hope that Paul can rejoin us shortly. And Esther, sorry to jump on you straight away. Are you ready to bring in your talk? Thank you, Esther.
Yes,
Please join us then. And Esther is the Community Engagement Manager at Leeds Museum. So Esther's going to take her session now.
Right, hello everybody. I'm hoping you can see that. Is that right? Just give me a thumbs up, Sally. Cheers, thank you very much. Let me see if I can start playing. So I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Leeds Museums and Galleries. Until recently, I was a Youth Engagement Officer, so some of the things I talk about are youth focused as well. And I found this morning incredibly interesting. I'm going to just share these thoughts with you. Before I start, by the way, I'm a white cis woman wearing an inappropriately unprofessional red hoodie with short brown hair and glasses. If that sounds like Harry Potter, you're not the first person to think that. One of the things I just wanted to point out that has been said a lot this morning is belonging. Every single presentation has spoken about belonging. And it strikes me, if we stop thinking about community engagement as a job and start thinking about it as belonging, we'll reframe quite a lot of what we do. The other thing that struck me was all of the presentations have not directly referenced, but have made reference to this idea of a hierarchy of need. If people's needs aren't being met, they can't possibly, including ourselves, we can't possibly feel safe or feel creative or express ourselves. And I think it's really important that we start to acknowledge those key things. And that means we step away and say, do you know what? I'm not here to talk about a museum collection until I've established that you are in a safe place in order to be able to do that. I was really inspired by all of the talks, I think, which have covered that. So I've got 13 minutes to talk a little bit about Leeds Museums and Galleries. I'm going to try and whiz through who we are and then end with some provocations like Victoria did, which I'm not even completely sure I agree with myself yet. I'm kind of mulling it through, so please do challenge me. We are a multi-site museum and gallery service, so there's 9 sites. We're really fortunate because we've got a community engagement team that sits across all of those sites. They're all part-time. But there is a number of us, although we're 30% short at the moment. We've also got a volunteer and skills development officer and 2 youth engagement officers. One of the things that has come up in the chat a little bit is this idea that it's quite difficult to do this kind of work without a massive team or a massive budget. Again, if we reframe what we do as belonging, I really feel like we can do it with nothing except for a cup of tea, because it is about listening to people and talking to people. And if we do that, we can figure out how we can help each other. What do we do in Leeds Museums and Galleries? We aim to nurture and commit equal relationships, loved what Victoria was saying about equity, and community partners and friends in order to foster a sense of belonging, encourage and enable creativity for everyone in Leeds, and increase well-being. So quite a big mission. How we do that is just think about all of our community projects under those themes. And there are a variety of community projects. And I'd love to say we sat down and brainstormed belonging, well-being and creativity, but actually quite a lot of what we do is in response to community needs, the people that we work with. So our aim within that belonging thing is that our communities feel welcomed and listened to, that they return. And that's quite important because it recently occurred to me that if we start logging people returning in our community groups and shouting about, we can indicate a sense of belonging by saying the behaviour matrix would suggest that if people are returning, they feel that they belong. That people see themselves reflected in the galleries and the collections, so that our social history gallery, which I hate, no longer is entirely male, white, rich, all of the things that social history galleries are. People see themselves. And that our sites run co-produced events and activities that communities want. Lots and lots of discussion about the word co-production and how we break that down. I would also add into that we co-produce opportunities. So we want people to work with us to figure out what kind of opportunities they want and how the museum service as a whole can help provide those. So within belonging, I suppose you would say a volunteer programme would work within that. Contemporary collecting, because that does a great job of showing our collections and our display spaces as just being a little bit more reflective of Leeds. And of course, co-curating, a huge part of what we do. I don't think I could define co-curating for you today because it is according to the people that we work with. So if somebody wants to take a whole case and like rip it out and start from scratch, providing within the structures and boundaries of the museum, we can do that. That's what we'd want to support them to do. But likewise, if they just want to work with us in a slightly different role where perhaps they don't feel they want to write the text, so we write it and send it through to them, that's also okay. We try not to put a
Have we lost Esther as well? We're not having a good afternoon, Rebecca. Let's give Esther a moment to come back.
I might remove her and then go back in.
Her rejoin.
And that's the best thing. But Paul is back.
Excellent. Well, you switch over the slides, and hopefully Paul is, with apologies that we lost you, Paul, hopefully you can pick up where you left off. Welcome back, Paul.
Paul, you're muted.
But I was talking about the arts and crafts that the prisoners, French prisoners, well, the French and the American prisoners of war had started. So there's always been a history of prisoners' arts and crafts. So originally they made them basically to share with the market. There was a daily market at Dartmoor, so people would come in and trade with the prisoners. So prisoners' goods, such as the toothpick in the picture, model ships, were used anything they wanted to, really. And we're lucky at Dartmoor Prison Museum to actually have some of these artifacts that we can actually put on display. But it wasn't just the prisoners of war. When the prison reopened again in 1850 as a convict prison, the practice of prisoner arts and crafts carried on. Can you do the next slide, please, Rebecca? What this slide will show is, again, some exhibits we have at the museum. But these are models that were made by convicts. So on the left, you see the classic matchstick model. This is actually a model of a church made. Prisoners used to make models out of match 15. If you were sent to prison, did you lose your liberty, you also automatically became a non-smoker. So getting hold of matches was an issue. So today you can see the model on the right. This one is actually made from matchsticks that were donated. So the one on the left, it's actually a musical box. So if you open the roof up, a tune plays, and there's elaborate designs inside. You've got a pew and an altar. So this is the kind of thing that the prisoners would have done. And it's one of the reasons that the museum was founded in the first place. The museum was basically open like this, or paintings. If you can see from the second picture, just through the cabinet, you can see a painting at the back, and that's a painting of the prison, again done by a prisoner, which would have formed
What is going on, eh? I think we've got some really bad internet problems across our speaker list here. How is Esther getting on, Rebecca? Is she back? No, we don't have Esther.
Sorry, I'm muted. No, I've lost Esther.
Okay.
I think can't see her at all, which is a real shame. I can still see Paul. I can still.
Okay. Maybe it was me. Sorry, Paul.
No, I don't think.
I think I was dropped out briefly. Right, so the model of on the right is actually Notre Dame Cathedral, and this is made up of 10,500 matchsticks, and it sits on gravel, which is an eggshell gravel. So as you can see, we do have a history of working with prisoners making their own arts and crafts. So what we do today, could you show the next slide, please, Rebecca? The prison is what's known as a training prison. So what we do, we things like plumbing, bricklaying, plastering, carpentry. And one of the workshops that we have is the concrete workshop. Can you show the next slide, please, Rebecca? So if you see the one on the left, these are basic concrete molds. And what we used to do was basically, as you can see, it's a frog. So everyone knows a frog is green. So the prisoners painted them green. As it turned out, we got quite a few artistic prisoners in who then basically gave license to decorate things as they saw fit.
Right, I think, yeah, are you back? I'm not sure we're getting through this well, and I'm not sure what to do.
I am back.
Keep trying, Paul, but we do keep losing you, so we might have to make the decision to cut back to Esther and try and see if we can help you out at all with an alternative way of getting in. But let's keep going for now.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so you see the models on the right, these are actually gnomes, but the prisoner decided they want to do them as Santa gnomes ready for Christmas. So we do interact with the prisoners. I mean, the community we engage with are the prisoners, which not many other museums can state they do. So we give them feedback on how things are going, how things are selling, we give them ideas for things to do. Recently, prisoners make bird boxes, owl boxes and bat boxes. We recently had a customer in asking if we did hedgehog boxes. So that's been fed back to the carpentry workshop. And they're now working on some hedgehog feeding stations and hedgehog boxes. So can you do the next slide, please, Rebecca? Again, it's not only basic workshops we run, embracing new technology. We do have a desktop publishing workshop. And basically we buy in blank white mugs and prisoners to come up with various designs to go on the mugs. And again, that's something that we sell through the museum shop. Go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So all was well and good, then the COVID pandemic hit. So what a lot of people don't realise is that when society was locked down, the prisoners had to lock down as well. So suddenly all the workshops stopped. Those that don't go to the workshops can go into education. Education stopped. Visits stopped as well. So there's no personal visits, no legal visits. So prisoners, a lot of prisoners were then locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day. So you can imagine you've got the COVID pandemic, you're locked down anyway. If you're at a situation when you lose your liberty, you're locked up in the prison, at least you do have association or workshops or activities you can go to, but suddenly you find that that's all taken away from you. So one of the things we put together was a display for how the pandemic was actually affecting the prison and the prisoners. Reason being for this, there seemed to be a lot of activity and movement within society to record the pandemic, because for future generations is what actually happened. And we thought this would be a valuable lesson or a valuable thing to show to visitors, because whilst we reflect on 200 years of prison history, we do get a lot of questions asking what happens in the prison today. So we thought this was something that we could show them today. So one of the things the prison had to try and do was find things to fill the prisoners' time. Things like activity packs, puzzles. You can see two dolls there. So crafts they could do. Going back to the matchstick models, they could buy in kits and make matchstick kits. But I came up with an idea of launching a competition for them, where the prisoners could actually reflect on how, rather than us dictating as a prison service how the prison service was dealing with it, how it was actually affecting the prisoners. So it came up with an idea with a competition. Either they could either produce a picture or a short story or poetry, basically reflecting on how the COVID pandemic was affecting them. Go the next slide, please, Rebecca. So if we just zoom in on two of the particular examples, you've got the one on the left. Again, picture drawn by a prisoner, but he's got some quotes as well. Quotes such as the prisoner saying, "Oh no, what are we going to do now?" And he's put a poster on the wall saying, "Due to the COVID, we are supporting all activity, suspending all activity and further notice." So this reflects a prisoner as how they felt. And then the one on the right is a bit more abstract. I think what's telling is in both pictures, if you look at the way that the bars and on the windows, or the windows are portrayed, they're very similar. Now, as well as working with the museum and the prisoners, we engaged a local art group called Arts Lab, who are based in Dartington down here in Devon, and they came up with a project called Sharing the Light. And this was basically an arts project whereby prisoners again would produce pictures and they'd be sent off to Arts Lab and they'd be displayed in their gallery. Well, they also did an online exhibition as well. So this was showing the public the levels of talent that we actually have in the museum. And it's something that's always reflected on by some of the visitors. We have pictures and models around the museum, and they always say, you know, how talented, you know, some of the prisoners are. And I suppose until they've got this time on their hands, they don't realise the talents they've got. So this is what we did here. We've now moved on a step. The next thing we want to be doing, that we're working on at the moment, is another project called Two-Way Mirror. And what this will do, we're working with a film company in London who will actually come into the prison and work with the prisoners. Again, using these types of pictures, whereby it'll be a film, again, it'll be shown in the museum. So what you'll see is the picture, then you'll have the prisoner themselves narrating over the top, explaining the thoughts and the motivations as to what actually inspired that piece of art. So again, it's allowing visitors to not only see the art, but also then hear firsthand from the prisoners the motivations as to what prompted them to come up with that particular design, and to go through all their thought processes and some of the anxieties and things they've been having. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the community that we work with is basically the prisoner community. We try and reflect the work that they do, and also the work that we do with them as well. The reason that we do this is basically we have a lot of talent in there. We're trying to nurture that talent. When they're released, we put them through qualifications as well, like NVQs or City and Guilds. So when they're released, we support them to find a job, basically because it's been shown if they are employed, they're less likely to reoffend, less likely to end up back in prison. So it's very much a rehabilitative and supported culture. And at Dartmoor, I think that the last survey was something like 16% above the national average for reoffending. So it shows that the work that we are doing is having an impact and hopefully improving the lives of the prisoners once they've been released. I think that's my last slide. Yep, that's it. That's me. I will provide details of the website for the museum if anybody wants to get in touch. So I'll wait till the end now for any questions, and hopefully there weren't too many interruptions. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Sterling job with the challenge of access. Well done. So we will zip back through to Esther and ask her to carry on with her presentation, and then we'll pull it all together for questions at the end. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you. I think I cut off, and I think I've picked up where I cut off. So hopefully it makes sense and I've not completely lost my train of thought. Sorry about that, everybody. So I was talking about belonging, wellbeing and creativity, and how they're the three core things that underpin our work. So we've covered a little bit about belonging, wellbeing. We've identified that quite a lot of our groups have strong wellbeing outcomes, intergenerational projects, the choirs and the regular talks programs being good examples of that. And again, there's been quite a lot of talk about how we can measure that kind of impact. And I think that is really about working across the city to try and figure out how other agencies in the city are evaluating those impacts and using a shared language. I think that's quite important for museums. So the other well-being thing I just wanted to quickly touch on was, oh, it started again, don't you just know? Being outside, hugely valuable gardening groups that we're running in partnership with Social Prescribing. It was interesting hearing what Sally was saying about thinking about 2 years to get a partnership started with the NHS and sort of get funding in. That's definitely my experience as well. You've really got to plug away at some of these relationships and accept that you may start 4 projects that go absolutely nowhere before you get the right one. And that's okay, that's part of it. So we've got at least 2, I think 3 now, volunteer gardening groups running across our sites. And also mindfulness. We have a really big abbey as part of our site, and it's a place of quite contemplative peace, I would say. And that is a quote almost directly from the mouth of the great Stevie Nicks from Fleetwood Mac. So about that site, by the way, when she came to Leeds, that's a longer story that I'll tell you later. It's amazing. But working within that abbey, we've worked with groups across Leeds, faith groups, and with mindfulness groups to deliver mindfulness activities. And it's now a huge part of that programme. And we're sort of seen as a place in Leeds that you can do that kind of work. Finally, opportunities to be creative and not to define creativity as exclusively curating or making art or whatever, to see a bit like I was saying before, to co-produce opportunities, to work with people to see what their idea of creativity is and not put our own boundaries on it. I was quite struck by a lot of the things that we were saying this morning, and I think we still work within the parameters of museums and professionalism, and we still look at structures. So we know that we need policies and procedures to operate, but our community friends don't necessarily have that same value put on policies and structures. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are other ways for people to contribute to what we do other than contributing directly to a policy. It is about relationships and how we can broker from those relationships the information that we need to guide our museums forward. So we have lots of groups that do creative things. I'm one of those museum professionals that has absolutely no creative bones in my body. Fortunately, I work with a really great team who come full of creative skills, and we work with artists. It was interesting, again, some of the discussions that were being said about paying artists this morning. And I think that comes back to co-producing opportunities. I mean, obviously, the payment question is a huge minefield and one that I don't have time to address at the moment. But I think one of the discussions we've been having recently is with a group of artists who are disabled, who are looking for more opportunities within Leeds, access-wise and employment-wise. And we spoke with them and said, right, what is it you want? Okay, you don't have the opportunities to apply for some of the briefs we might put out for engagement. So let's create a programme where we employ 6 people on kind of a contract over a year. We will work with you. You will get the opportunities. You work across our programmes, a bit like a trainee type programme. And I think those kind of opportunities where we've said, what is it you need? Right, what can we do within our very strict local authority boundaries to support that? I think, well, that is a relationship, isn't it? Young adults, that this is our youth programme, all kinds of dancing, art and digital DJing that happens within that. And also, obviously, there is the more traditional creating films and displays that I think is an important part of our work. Most of all, it's about the people, though. It is about the people. I cannot stress that enough. If you spend your time chatting with people, it is not time wasted. I used to think that every time someone from a museum caught me talking with a young person or a community partner and we were just chatting, I used to be embarrassed and ashamed and trying to hide that. I promise you, it is the most productive bit of my work. Time chatting is never time spent wasted. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, money spent on food is never money wasted. Those are the 2 foundations of our work. And that is because it is to do with a relationship. It is to do with people, and people need to feel special. And if you invite someone into your home or you go to someone's home, you would take some food or you would offer them a drink or something, and then you would ask them about themselves. And I think if we start from that very basic foundation, all of our work will take on a slightly different slant. So when I was planning this, I thought, right, Esther, what does the future of community engagement look like in the 30 seconds you've got left? First of all, we need to think, who are we? We know what we're not because we say it all the time. We're not social workers, we're not curators, we're not learning officers, we're definitely not therapists, we're not carers. But do we know what we are? Do we really know that? What do we do and what do we aspire to do? Do we engage people in what we already do? I think all of us can say that's not really what we want to do. Do we have a formal agreement with people we work with? And apologies now to Victoria, because I'm sort of about to touch a bit on partnership working, and I know she's done a really great presentation about that. So sorry, Victoria, I'm just putting provocations out there. Or do we have a trusting relationship with people who we know and who know and like us? The official definition of engagement references formal arrangements, meeting at a fixed time, and employment contracts. It is the efforts of an organisation to engage people in what they do. That's not what we're trying to do. A partnership is an agreement between organisations to work together. Now, I like that more than I like engagement, but there is still this thing about organisations work that I'm not completely keen on. Friendship, the person you know well and like a lot, someone who's not your enemy and who you trust. I want that to be what I do. So reframing what we do as friendship, is it ethical? I'm paid. Can you be paid to be someone's friend? And how do we measure or quantify or justify that? I think they are very tricky things, and that's why I caveated this talk by saying I haven't really kind of figured it all out yet. But these are the musings. I suppose what Sally said, if you don't have an idea, then you can't even start. My friendships do have boundaries. My friends know what they can and can't do with me. They know what they can and can't take advantage of. I tell my friends when they do something wrong, and I expect them to tell me when I've done something wrong. It is a social partnership. It's an agreement that we've never formalized. I treat my friends with compassion. I accept them for who they are, and I expect them to accept me. I would never endanger them on purpose. My friends and I decide together what we do, although we might take on different roles. I care for them, and my friendships are equal. And when I thought through all those things, I thought actually the relationships that I formed with our community friends during COVID, particularly when everything was equal because we had no museum and we had no projects and we just had to look after each other, have been more formed on that basis. And as a result of that, a bond of trust has formed, which means that when projects have come up, they've come up organically. Sometimes they've come up from conversations about Disney Plus or about YouTube or about whether Pringles are ethical. That's how we formulated our conversations, not because I've sat down with a project plan. Now, I want to say this is not my ideal way of working. I am someone that loves structure and a project plan, but I've started to realize that that really isn't the way that museums are trying to work, and it's not the way we should try to work. We do need to be honest about our relationships. We need to have very clear and transparent boundaries. That is so important. I'm not a friend. I want to treat this as more than a partnership, but I'm not someone's friend. There has got to be more to it than that. Otherwise, it's not honest. We need to be mindful of staff welfare. We are asking people now to work with their personalities, with their souls, I suppose, for a better word, not just their professionalism. And I think it's a huge toll on staff. So I'm always a big fan of Victoria's Moments of Happiness budget. And I think we really need to acknowledge that if we do this work properly, it will take its toll. We need all our work to be guided by our community friends to make up for that massive power imbalance that will always exist because we are the museum. There's a historic and a current, literally geographical building-based power imbalance. And we need to acknowledge the limitations of the structures within which we try to do this work and the inevitable imbalance of power. We can't make everything equal. Museum friends. I feel like someone did that before. Maybe that's something we need to return to and start thinking about what we're doing as museum friends again, even though that went out of fashion. Right, you'll be very relieved to hear that even though my watch hasn't buzzed, that is my time up.
Thank you, Esther, and well done for being flexible. I'm full of questions myself after that, but I'm going to hold on to them and introduce now our final speaker for this session, who is Elma Glasgow, and she's going to talk to you about a new community interest company called Aspire Black Suffolk, and that's emerged from the Power of Stories exhibition in Ipswich. So Elma's going to tell us some more. Over to you, Elma. Oh, you're on mute, Elma.
So sorry, guys, for some reason, when I shared the screen, it popped up on my other screen. It doesn't normally do that. So it threw me a bit, so apologies. So so I'm Elma Glasgow. I'm not a museum professional, so I think what I'm going to be talking to you about today is going to come from the community side of things, which is really exciting actually, because hopefully I'll be able to give you a very different perspective, which I really hope will be of some help. But I'm a new director of the new CIC called Aspire Black Suffolk, which has been born out of the Power of Stories exhibition by Ipswich Museums. And currently we don't have a website. We are literally in the process of starting up. So we haven't quite got around to developing a website. That's coming in the early new year, but we can be found on LinkedIn and Facebook. That's our handle right there. So who are we? Aspire Black Suffolk is a new Black women-led community interest company, which is challenging inequalities by engaging with students, young people, employers, and wider communities in meaningful and creative ways. We champion the Black community and also provide platforms for people in the community to have their voices heard. I'm one of the directors. My focus are communications, or my focus is communications and culture. Francine Jones is social justice. Francine was the first female president of the UK's Black Police Association. She's an expert in stop and search and other areas of policing and youth justice. Tonya Wilson is taking care of community inclusion and development. Alicia Soanes is a powerhouse of a further education expert. She's just won a high-level further education award for her work in embedding Black history throughout the year at West Suffolk College, and she's made West Suffolk College the first FE college in the whole country to actually do this, and it's happening in little old Suffolk. And it wasn't just thanks to Power of Stories, but some more amazing activity has come out of the work that she's done at the college. Okay, so for those of you who managed to get over to Suffolk, to Ipswich, to see the Power of Stories, you would have seen this when you first walked in. Our origin started with a partnership, a community partnership, or friendship actually, all of those things, with Colchester and Ipswich Museum Service and the Power of Stories exhibition at Christ Church Mansion in Ipswich. It ran from June to October this year. And as you can see, features 3 original costumes from Marvel's Black Panther movie, which were on loan from Marvel Studios over in LA. So I just want to run through a very quick, just to run through the key points of Power of Stories and what it was about and the outcome. Power of Stories was designed from the outset to be catalytic and equitable. It achieved both of those things. It was also created to attract a greater diversity through better and meaningful and authentic representation. It did that. As I mentioned, there are 3 costumes worn by Chadwick Boseman, Letitia Wright, and Danai Gurira. All costumes can be seen on set, on the screen in the first Black Panther film. The second one is now in production. When the Power of Stories was on display, it was the only place outside the USA where you could actually see original costumes. I understand the costumes have now gone to Asia, but we still can credit the Power of Stories to have been the only place in Europe where the costumes were on display. Exhibition was progressive and an example of best practice in community engagement / partnerships / friendships and decolonisation. It's important to know that Power of Stories was actually well into planning and production, pre-production I suppose you would call it, before George Floyd's horrific murder and the resurgence of BLM. So Ipswich, the curators of Ipswich Museum knew that they needed to do something quite urgently, even without that push from the momentum created by this horrible tragedy in America. The outcomes was that Power of Stories broke footfall records for the venue for Christ Church Mansion. It beat the Rodin exhibition, which was I think 2 years prior or 3 years prior, with COVID sort of 2020 in the middle there. And it also beat footfall for Made in Suffolk, which was the Ed Sheeran exhibition that even involved Ed Sheeran and his parents. They live locally, hence the occasion of the exhibition. So we were really chuffed about that, considering that in the past, anything Black focused or Black led generally has a negative depiction in heritage. So that is a generalization, but that's something that I've noticed my whole life and I don't think can be denied. So that was marvelous to have seen that. There was a truly authentic voice throughout the exhibition and the related events program, which I'll come to in a moment. And community curators made sure that the voice came through, voice of the community and the community's heritage and culture did come through crystal clear. The result was a highly successful, popular and pioneering exhibition with legacy that had already been established before the exhibition had even opened. And it was far-reaching. It had a far-reaching and positive impact, and it was indeed catalytic. And Aspire Black Suffolk is just part of the legacy of Power of Stories. Okay, so it all started out by me attending a community gathering. I was invited to a community meeting, which was chaired by the Chief Executive of the Ipswich Suffolk Council for Age and Equality. It wasn't or led by, chaired at all by anyone from the museum. The curators knew that as being middle-class, cis white women, they basically had no place to lead such meetings. It wasn't their job. It was a community's job to take ownership of that. And they were there almost as observers and to chip in now and then with their ideas and thoughts from a curatorial position only. So when this community gathering happened, it was February 2020, the Marvel costumes had already been secured, so I'd come in fairly late into the process. During the meeting, we exchanged ideas and provided feedback to the plans for the exhibition layout. There was also lots of discussions around the implications of these programs, the implications of having a Black focused exhibition in somewhere like Ipswich. You know, it's not Brixton, it's not Hackney. So that was a really important thing to discuss because there were lots of concerns as well about trolling and racism. And also it was basically an open forum and a very safe place for people of community to swap ideas and be very, very honest with the museum professionals who are present. And at the end of the meeting, someone volunteered me to manage the community response, which was basically the origins of Aspire Black Suffolk. And I just want to point out this lovely panel here. So that was a direct quote from an amazing activist from Ipswich called Lanai. And in it, she talks about some of the images captured by Neil Kenlock, who was a senior member of the British Black Panther movement. And the images that we had were on loan from the BCA in Brixton. Okay, and that's one of the images. Don't know if you can see the top banner there, but I've used these words because that's basically how I felt and how Aspire Black Suffolk started. It was unexpected. I was in the middle of trying to save my home during COVID because my usual PR business had been destroyed by the first lockdown, and I was struggling to survive financially. But even so, I committed myself to it. I thought it was a really important moment in history here. I just deeply felt the importance of Power of Stories and its potential to have a positive impact, long-lasting impact and long-lasting change. Suffolk has a massive problem. It has lots of problems. It has lots of positives as well, but one of the biggest problems is horrendous, chronic underrepresentation of people of colour. It has a very superficial public image, which is rolling hills, beautiful coastline, and lots of rich white people. Yes, they all exist, absolutely, but there's a lot more to it, a lot more diversity and a lot more cultural influences as well, but that just isn't shown in previous collections or out in the wider cultural world at all. Although it is now, things are changing and things are changing very quickly. To start with, I held regular Zoom meetings with community members, so grassroots organisations and individuals who want to be involved. The ex-mayor was involved. So people who from the Black community and also allies from other minority communities as well came on board and joined these meetings. It snowballed. I think the first meeting started out with, about 10, 15, and at one point we had about 30, 40 people on the Zoom meetings all pitching in with ideas. Everyone was just ridiculously excited, and I was just trying to organise everything. And we eventually created, with the support of the museums, and I'll come on to that in a moment, a programme of cultural events around Suffolk and a list of costings. And most of my time was voluntary. As I said, I was completely dedicated to it because I knew Suffolk had to change. I'd previously lived in London for 20 years, although I was brought up in rural Cambridgeshire in the 70s and 80s. I spent a lot of time in in the world's biggest cultural and ethnic melting pot, that is London. I've also traveled a lot and lived abroad, so I know what diversity feels like, what it looks like, and what it should be, how it can be used for good. And Suffolk was not doing any of that at all. So I decided that now was the time to be able to have some kind of impact in very close partnership with the rest of the Black community and the museums. So the museum team I was working with very, very closely was mainly Melanie and Eleanor. They were responsible mainly for the look and feel of Power of Stories in very close partnership with the community curators. So they worked together constantly on making sure the exhibition was just so, had the authenticity, had the right level of, I guess, curatorial input from a museum perspective. And anyone who managed to see the exhibition agree that everyone did an amazing job. They made a sterling effort, they really did. Now, Dr. Frank Hargrave was amazing in helping us raise money. So he submitted an Arts Council application on Aspire Black Suffolk's behalf. And Eleanor Root worked silly hours. Well, they all worked silly hours really in the run up to the exhibition. I just want to make sure that, I give them a big shout out because, they're often behind the scenes, and I wanted to make sure that people knew how incredible they all are. And we also secured money from the Heritage Lottery Fund thanks to Eleanor. And one thing that I must say, we talk about I think Victoria mentioned that community engagement is difficult and hard, and you really need to work at it over a long period of time. So I guess Ipswich being quite a small town, the population is under 200,000, I believe. They already kind of had a network in place that I'd worked with previously, but nothing as profound as Power of Stories had happened before. So they did have to approach it very, very differently. And I've had many, many conversations with Eleanor and Melanie about their approach. And they said it wasn't a choice for us, it was necessity. And I think someone mentioned it was a risk as well. Sometimes you have to take risks. For them, I just don't think they saw it as a risk. They saw it as a necessity, and it absolutely had to happen to make Power of Stories the exhibition everybody needed it to be. So they just went for it. And they gave me and all the other members of the community free rein. We were autonomous to do what we wanted to do, regardless of the impact it might have had on the museum. They just knew the time was now. And I think that trust, that very deep trust, worked so well. Everyone was on side. The people who got involved with passion. They understood that the museum were completely authentic and completely transparent as well in terms of what they wanted the Black community to do. And so it all gelled and it worked out really nicely. They didn't have to fight for people to get involved. People were calling me from around the county. They were calling museums from around the county. We both had people from outside the county getting in touch. So it just happened very organically because I think the intention was there. It was all about that trust and intention and authenticity from the very outset that made Power of Stories and Aspire Black Suffolk such a success. So this was our first incarnation. So we've only just become a formal entity as a CIC. We were just an informal network of individuals and organisations. That was our first logo, which was actually a collaborative effort between two further education design students from two different colleges, which was ACE. I think they were both students of colour as well. So they were really proud to be able to finally have a design project that would reflect their own values as well. So I'll give you some examples of the kind of events that we managed to roll out. This was a beautiful new photographic collection by John Ferguson. He lives locally. He was actually the very first Black star photographer on Fleet Street. So he has lots of stories to tell, believe me. He's also shot countless A-list celebrities. He's done lots of paparazzi work. He's won multiple awards. You name it, he's done it basically. He's an incredible, incredible artist. And he created a collection to reflect the different stories from the Black community from around Suffolk, not just Ipswich, where the majority of the of the Black community is based, but from people around the county, which was amazing. So this also got into The Guardian. I managed to place it in The Guardian as well, with click-throughs with direct links through to the Power of Stories exhibition website, which was fabulous. And yeah, I actually had to go out and find extra money for this. It was very difficult to raise money for, but you know, the actual original prints are A3 size, and they are amazing when you see them up close. So that was an outdoor exhibition just down the road from Christchurch Mansion in July. Oh, sorry, it was in August in the end. And these are examples. Sorry, it's a little bit messy, but I am not a designer. So these are some examples of the kind of activities and events that happened. So you can see there was lots of African culture and heritage activity throughout the 5 6 months we were running. We had lectures. The picture down at the bottom was a big wall mural, which was influenced by the Power of Stories exhibition and the Spire Black Suffolk. We had an amazing creative writing workshop just for people of colour. I don't think this ever happened in this part of the country before. So that was groundbreaking. And that was with a National Theatre writing company called High Tide, who are based up here. We had gigs for young people who use Power of Stories for inspiration for new music and spoken word and poetry performances. We have film that I haven't got time to include here. We've had other performances. Speaking of which, Jazzy B came up to a small festival up here called Woodbridge Festival of Arts and Music. Jazzy B had a great time, and it was great to have such an amazing Black music icon come up to Little Old Suffolk and basically just, you know, entertain people. And that was done in association with the Spire Black Suffolk. Les Spain is the former head of Motown UK, and he's responsible for introducing funk music to the UK. He actually manages Jazzy's, is one of his clients. Jazzy's one of his clients. So there's that connection there. But the guy who organised the Les Spain events, and he's still coming up, is a real ally of Spire Black Suffolk and Power of Stories. We have an ongoing relationship with Les and hopefully with Jazzy as well, which is really exciting. Prima Donna Festival is a leading women-led literary festival. And they invited 2 young Black activists. One of them was Lanai, who you saw earlier in the presentation, to record a podcast episode in front of a live audience, which I thought was really courageous. These 2 young women talking about, you know, what it feels like to be Black living in Suffolk, racism, trolling, bullying, and also the positive side to being Black and, you know, sort of celebrating the culture, that sort of thing. So yeah, they're just a few of the things that happened. So much more happened that I'm able to show you. This all came from the Power of Stories exhibition. Okay. So as CIC, we're launching officially in early 2022 with an exciting project, which I can't talk about publicly at the moment. But generally, we're going to be offering services like Black History and Cultural Education, Black History and Cultural Educational and Creative Packs, educational consultancy. We're training teachers and other academic staff in how to deliver Black history resources. It's not as straightforward as you think in terms of using certain language and certain images and visuals. If you can't see it from a Black perspective, they can be easily really offensive. So having that sensitivity is really, really important, and that's what we want to help people with. We're also training in diversity and inclusion across all protected characteristics for the heritage, cultural and corporate sectors. I'm going to be offering training and marketing just to ensure appropriate representation. We're also going to be partnering with cultural events. I'm now on the steering committee for the Prima Donna Festival. So we are going to be doing more heritage work, more festival works, music concerts, theatre, etc. And excitingly, we're going to be partnering with all Suffolk museums to help them develop their Black history collection. So one of our community members called Imani Sohendo is hopefully going to be contracted to do some really exciting research around untold Black histories. And they hopefully will end up in our museums. So Sorry, Sally, I just saw your prompt. It didn't pop up on my screen, I'm afraid. So I hope I didn't overrun too much.
All right, that's quite all right. It's a good point to end on. We're going to move into questions. We've had some up in the chat. And once again, like last time, if you would like to ask your question yourself, then please raise your hand using the Zoom function, and I'll see your hand go up and invite you to unmute your microphone. I've got a long list of questions that I'd like to ask from this session, where some of them have come up in the chat and some of them are my own. So I'll start off by launching into those. Paul, we had a couple of questions come up for you about quite practical points, like did you pay the prisoners, do you pay the prisoners who produce the stuff that you work with? And also, how did you reach the prisoners during lockdown? Were you able to do Zoom with people in their cells or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. First, I'll take the first question first. Yes, prisoners are paid for the things that they produce and the workshop, which workshop they go into, and also which level of learning they are at. I'll give you an example. The best paid job in the prison, like prisoners produce things in blind to learn Braille, and we have an agreement with one of the companies that provides some of our museum guides, a company called Tormark, and if anything from their catalogue, if they get approached by somebody saying, can you produce this in Braille, then they can get in touch with the prisoner, and the prisoners will produce a Braille copy of whichever book they're after. Going back to the second question, how do we access the prisoners? Somebody mentioned, did they have Zoom? Well, they didn't have Zoom. There is a system called Purple Visits, which is the prison services version of Zoom, and that's been used since when the lockdown was in place. Basically, because the visit stopped, it gave them a way to access friends, relatives, legal counsel. It started off as a trial, but as the pandemic went on, we didn't know how long it was going to go on for. So basically, Purple Visits was rolled out across the prison estate, meeting with friends, family each week. As opposed to us, normally, under normal circumstances, what we do, actually go down to the workshops ourselves. We talk to the prisoners, we engage with the prisoners over, what products are going well, what ideas they've got. For example, in 2019, prisoners came with the idea, it was the Rugby World Cup, to produce things like gnomes, frogs, lizards in colours of the various countries, like New Zealand, England, Australia. And we gave them feedback on how well that went. So what they did this year, when it was the Euros, they did the same thing, but with obviously the football teams, the representative nations. The way we actually access them when they were locked down, there is a system which is known as notices to prisoners, whereby if we want to get in touch with them or circulate any information to them, these are produced daily and basically posted in the wings for the prisoners to read, or as they were locked down, they're actually posted through the cells. With regards to the exhibition that we did in the museum, the COVID exhibition, the competition entries, they produced a brochure and collated all the different entries and put that together and that was circulated around the prisoners in the prison, so they could see what their fellows prisoners were actually making and their thoughts on COVID. So it was a way of letting them know that everyone was in the same boat and everyone was going through an anxious time. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Victoria, we had a question for you as well about, you mentioned community anchors and the difficulty of everybody asking those same organisations for time and support. So how did you overcome that kind of bottleneck, if you like? How do you work around it and find other relationships?
Really practically, just by spending time in the communities and the spaces that we worked in. There is no magic answer. So because we kind of work in kind of quite set geographical locations, and my team spent a lot of time working on the ground, it's kind of people that they met, came across. The interesting thing about community anchors is they don't necessarily always realise they're a community anchor. So there are some people that kind of do that kind of within the local authority context, there are people that are kind of paid within that context too as kind of community ambassadors. But a lot of the people that we've ended up working with as part of our programme that have linked us up with kind of the who's who aren't necessarily people that would say they were the community anchor. They might be the person that just happens to run a Facebook group, or just happens to be the lady that volunteers at the food bank. So it's not always, so a lot of our work comes from just who we've met. Yeah, very quickly.
So that was,
you do realise quite quickly who the overburdened ones are as well.
Yes, it was one of the things we learned from doing Partnerships with Purpose, actually, was everybody in the room, the museums in the room, always had relationships with like the big beasts of each industry, whether it be it aging, homelessness, whatever else, but they might not necessarily know the people who run the unit 2 streets away from their museum, and it's that relationship that we needed to help forge in that forum. Another question that relates to your talk initially, Victoria, but I think I'll broaden it out to everybody. There was a question about who did your health and wellbeing research, but to broaden that out a bit to everybody, kind of what data do you have about the lockdown or the various lockdowns? You know, how can you evidence your impact over that period? Is it too soon, or did everything happen in such a rush? We don't know. Over to you. Victoria, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, practically our evaluation is done by a company called ARC Research and in collaboration with Sheffield Hallam University. What that means in kind of a day-to-day basis is we worked with them to design the tools that we use in our sessions, but practically it's me and my team that carry out the day-to-day evaluation. So we make sure the data is collected and then it's interpreted by the consultant and the university. In terms of impact of COVID and the data we've collected, so we collect lots of different types of data. So we collect wellbeing questionnaires, which are your typical Warwick Edinburgh type thing you might have seen before. But we also complete facilitated diaries. So after each session we kind of have this quick fire form that we fill out. And that's when we've noticed some of the most powerful evidence on the impact has been from those more informal kind of forms. You might notice that one week Julie's completely quiet, but then fast forward 5 weeks, she's a chatty Cathy. So we kind of look at those kind of things. COVID, we carried on doing those kind of things. We had the Warwick Edinburgh, and we have those in those questionnaires, but we've also carried out quite a lot of focus groups, specifically with groups that we worked with during COVID that we hadn't worked with before. And that we've pulled kind of data out of that. The wellbeing data was really hard to measure during COVID because the way Warwick Edinburgh's work is it's kind of how have you felt in the past 7 days, and it was really hard to separate the impact of the pandemic on people's mental health and kind of there was just so much noise. There was so much noise when it comes to people's mental health and people's. You could really track on the data when we'd had a lockdown announcement. So regardless of how absolutely amazing our session was going to be, it was going to have very little impact on well-being. So we've had to take into account those skews, and that's where our academics have helped us out with that.
Esther, do you want to chime in on some of this as well?
Valuation. So I have a complicated answer to that I'll try and simplify. We've collected data traditionally. I'm quite new as community engagement manager, and we've always collected data as required by funders. And I would say, without wanting to offend anybody from a learning background, I feel that our data that we're asked to collect is as if it was learning data, turned slightly with a different title at the top. So my mission is to try and look at the data we collect, because I appreciate that if councillors or funders say to me, how many people do you help, do you work with, that's the answer they want. But I would like to be able to say, well, I don't know that answer, but what I do know is that 15,000 people were creative because of us, or 27,000 people felt like they belonged because of us, or whatever. So I would like to start using that language, because funders and people won't change it. Now, how we gather and evaluate that is very difficult. I've got a few different approaches. The first is to try and establish a well-being matrix that can be used across all of our projects that is very non-intrusive. So just literally probably using the 5 well-being ways to well-being and just mapping how our services help that. The second is to work in partnership across the city and look at what, in my case, Leeds is trying to do to help communities. So employment, I think we massively help employment in Leeds. Sustainability, safe communities, and I think we need to look at using those languages more. So I'm involved in quite a lot of strategic groups that within the council that baffle me and confuddle me, but I feel that until I get a grasp of what the city is trying to do, I can't evidence the museum services doing that. I think as a sector, as a community friendship sector, we need to move away very, very, very quickly from the traditional learning and engagement model of collecting data, because it's not relevant and it won't help us. And what we'll do is end up with 2 parallel models where we're collecting what we know we're doing and we're collecting what other people want us to say we're doing.
See, and I think you're dead right, because I think what funders want to understand a link between is if you do this really intensive work with 15 people, what does that mean 5 years later? Because it doesn't look like good value for money on the surface when you're only working with 15 people. And so it's working through all of those issues. I do want to bring in everybody else as well. And so another question that springs to my mind from what Elma was saying is we're talking about doing work that everybody is so completely committed to because of their values and because they bring their whole selves to it. And we're talking about trust, authenticity, and Elma mentioned people working silly hours and things like that. And we've mentioned how you look after yourself, but I wondered if between the 4 of you, you could give me some examples of how you should look after yourself in this work. Elma, do you want to start us off?
I can start with, I have ME, which is an autoimmune condition. And COVID just added to that. I can't speak on behalf of the team at the museum, no. They're fine. They work extremely hard, but I think when you're passionate about something, it's always hard to stop and breathe. But one of the museum with Melanie is a mum of 3, and I don't know how they did it. I was incredibly impressed. They're fine. Their well-being is fine, and they're having lots of rest, and things have slowed down hugely for them, which was great to see. They had to drive a lot of the activity going on their end because they're the only ones who really had a deep understanding of what the community wanted and needed, actually. So no one else could have really stepped into their shoes, which was fine by them because they wanted to do the work. For me, it was incredibly hard. There were times when I did think, what on earth am I doing? This is crazy. Especially, I did get some money from the Arts Council, but it covered a tiny part of what I did. And I was also, as I mentioned, trying to battle to save my income, which comes through my PR consultancy mainly at the moment. But I have a garden, so I would go out and I would garden vegetables. Rubbish harvest this year because the weather was so unpredictable in early summer. Sorry, don't want to bore you with that. But I think also having a museum team there for me and with me was fantastic. I became part of their team, and I think having that really strong community spirit, which we all had, it was incredibly hard work, but it was also really celebratory. And I think that always takes the edge off exhaustion and stress and anxiety. Opening day was amazing. We're the first people to see these costumes, and we were sharing pictures on WhatsApp, and it was just wonderful. We actually have now a long-standing community group on WhatsApp, and we support each other through that. And the community, the museum team are still part of that WhatsApp network. And the media is involved there now, so local media, so we're all learning from each other. And I think that's helped everyone through it. And there were challenging moments, but me having ME, sometimes you just absolutely have to stop. You know, you can't argue with your body, you have to stop. And I think when you're well, you don't feel it as it's not as obvious as you know, until you hit really severe burnout. And that's what happened to me a few years ago, which is why I have ME. So you know, just stop, take time out, don't feel guilty about it, switch off your laptop, walk away, watch Netflix, go for a walk, go see some friends, go for a drink, do anything but work, and just rest when you need to. Even if you don't feel like you need to rest. So yeah,
I think that's good advice for all of us. Victoria, I can see you've put a link in the chat. Do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I can answer this question with a different hat on. So in my copious amounts of spare time, I am also on the organising committee of a group called Glam Cares, which was formed precisely because of what we're talking about, because community engagement in galleries, libraries and museums is brilliant, but it definitely has some of its own kind of issues, its own beasts of issues, some of which are around your own personal well-being. The group came to be because a group of us were meeting together online to kind of talk through specific community engagement issues, to kind of share the burden of some of the things we're working on. And we decided that we needed to open that up further. It wasn't just the four of us that were having these conversations, it needed to be had wider. So Glam Cares is, check us out on Twitter, but essentially we aim to be a peer support care network for people that work in community engagement. What that looks like in practical terms is we have kind of get-togethers online and in person, so you can talk to people that do jobs just like you. Particularly useful if you're the only person in your organisation that works in engagement. We also offer training, and we are setting up a buddying and proper kind of caring system next year. So keep an eye on us. But I think that for me, when I think about what you need to look after yourself, it's a really hard question because support looks and feels different to different people. For some of my team, support means they want a cup of tea after their session and like a really informal natter. For some other people in my team, and me included, support looks more structured. It's more around kind of a coaching model. So as a manager, what I try and do is equip my team to invest in their own self-care and see self-care as something that's not a luxury, that it's not a bubble bath all the time. Self-care can just be reclaiming your lunch break and saying no. So yeah, I kind of bang on about that on the internet all the time. So follow me on Twitter.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move us on to one last question because it's come up in the chat here about that link between your personal commitment and your authenticity and your values, and is it possible to translate that into intimacy across the whole organisation? Esther, you've nodded, so I'm going to come to you. Can you give us any thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I saw the question pop up, I was like, oh, that is a great question. It is a dilemma I have with myself regularly because it's really tricky, and I don't think I've always got it right. Sometimes when I've tried to move a project on, I feel that the loyalty within the project lies with me, and that's a responsibility I've got to take for not actually having great practice. There's a theory in social work, and psychology, attachment theory, that some of you might be aware of. And one of the models that works on is that if you have a strong attachment generally to a loved one, then the attachment, that means you're capable of forming that attachment, and the attachment can be safely moved on. Not to say that original person doesn't matter, but just that the attachment can be transferred. So I try and keep that in mind. And I suppose in a practical sense, what that looks like is, first of all, building a relationship, often with me or with a staff member, and then slowly introducing other staff members, and slowly moving to like other rooms or other sites, or if you're off-site, like Victoria prefers, moving to other places, just so that there is a possibility to spread that attachment around a bit. And over time, I have found that approach works. It's not always the way, but it does work. And the other thing is to think about, I hate the phrase exit strategy, but to think about progress pathways through your museum service. So my absolute dream is that we will have people that work work with us, our friends will work with us, and then they will maybe get volunteering opportunities that don't come through the community engagement team, they've had elsewhere, and then hopefully they'll move through the rest of the service, and then eventually they'll get a job within the museum service. That's what I want to see. And if we're really upfront and honest about that, then that kind of transferal of attachment is a positive thing as well as a necessary thing.
Would anybody else like to weigh in? We've got a minute or two before we switch over to our last session of the day. So I'd invite you to make any last comments.
I don't think I could say it any better than what Esther just said.
Then I'm going to take the chance, Elma, to ask you one last question that came up in the chat about, do you think it would make a difference on the work you've done on the exhibition? Do you think it would make a difference if you worked with staff from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds?
Yes, it would, absolutely. And the up here in this part of the country, most people in a certain level of seniority are white middle class people. And the team I was working with at Ipswich Museum would wholeheartedly agree with me when I say yes, and they appreciate that and understand it. I think having an innate understanding and an instinct for what is appropriate and what isn't helps. And I've unfortunately experienced a lot of ideas from museum professionals since I started working, in the sector. It's all still very new to me, which are just offensive and just completely disrespectful. They're based on very old ideas. And I think the need for progress definitely includes creating new career pathways, starting with education, starting with schools. And that's something that we're doing actually with Suffolk County Council. They want us to help create new career pathways for school leavers from university graduates and people already in heritage who perhaps want to establish their careers here develop and establish their careers here in Suffolk. So that's what we're going to be doing, fingers crossed, with Suffolk Museums.
And in a last moment of plug, I'm going to ask Rebecca to put a link in the chat to the MA's recently launched decolonisation guidance, because it's brilliant and it's related and it's at all levels and functions of a museum, of how to begin your way in this topic. So there you go. Thank you, Rebecca. And on that point, thank you to all four of our speakers this afternoon. Apologies for the technical issues. Well done, Paul and Esther particularly, for working around it. And please stick around. We've got one last session to go for the final half hour this afternoon. So I'm gonna segue into that now and bring us back to the discussion session that I talked about first thing this morning, which is our chance to think and talk in smaller groups and to reflect on what you've learned, what you've heard today, and what you take away from it as you're learning to apply in your working lives. So Rebecca, if you could put those questions back up that we had first thing this morning. What we're going to do is put you all in breakout rooms, and we're going to give you about 15 minutes with these questions on the screen, discussing what can the sector do to progress participatory practice. So that's thinking about what you want and need on that macro scale, and then bring it back down into a much tighter focus of what learning will you take away and apply from this event. So have a chat, let everybody have a turn talking, and then when we come back in 15 minutes, I'm going to ask for feedback. Now, I really hope to make that voluntary feedback for people who've got something that they're inspired by, that they want to tell us about. But beware speakers, if the silence lasts too long, I will look out for somebody to pull into the conversation. So can I have a few thumbs up if that's clear, what we're going to do? Shall I keep explaining?
I will share this slide again when people are in breakout rooms, by the way.
Lovely. So Rebecca's going to put you into breakout rooms, discuss those questions, and after 15 minutes, we're going to come back for a bit of feedback before the end of the day. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your chats. Hello everyone, welcome back. Are we all back in the main room? Is that sorted, Rebecca? All good? Right, I hope you had some really fruitful discussions in there. I was in a room of 3 and we had such a wide-ranging conversation from the massive to the level of detail. In my room, we talked about, we made a very good point about how, and it's a discussion I'm interested in, about how museums are a civic space. They're part of that social infrastructure, and through participatory practice, if we're seeing more and more and more in that light, then museums and culture needs to be reflected more in those wider strategies about how governments deliver health and well-being and education outcomes. And we're not quite there yet. We're trying to deliver it, but we're not as integral in those wider strategies. So that's something that we need to take away on behalf of the macro scale and the wider sector. I'm going to put up the participants list on the side. So would anybody else like to feed back some of the discussions that they had in the room? Big plus points if you step forward to do it.
I'm happy to discuss for my group.
Thank you, please do.
Hi, I'm Lindsay from National Museum of Scotland. We had a few Scottish contingents in our team, which was nice. So yeah, there's a few key points, but I guess a few takeaways were, one was about kind of taking risk and, you know, not being scared to actually take risks. We often, like, well, especially for an organisation as large as ours, it's often that's the headliner. What if this doesn't happen, or what if only 3 people and as youth engagement I do, what if only 3 young people turn up? But you know, it's about turning it on its head and saying, well, what happens if we don't do this? You know, we've got 3 young people turn up, then that's great, because otherwise we can't, you know, make any strides forward. So I guess a pledge to people to say, maybe take some risk and encourage your colleagues and organisation to take a wee bit risk. And the other thing was, in terms of organisation, again, I work for a large organisation, and I guess it tends to be that the learning and engagement team, they're responsible for the community engagement. And I'm saying, you know, we're trying to get the whole organisation on board in terms of it's everybody's role to engage with community members. So, you know, if you work in HR, I can just imagine them saying, oh, but I'm no community engagement, what do I know about youth engagement? And it's like, well, we need to get everybody on board. You know, there might be opportunities to do traineeships or volunteer organisations for young people 16 to 25. So how do we collectively bring a whole organisation together, and it's not just that small team of 4 people? That's your job. I guess there was a lot about tangible outcomes, and that fear of, again, we're just having cups of tea and chatting to people. Well, I've been a community learning development officer for 15 years, and I've been paid all my career just to chat and have cups of coffee with each other. My job wouldn't work otherwise, you know. Now stuck in my living room without the opportunity to kind of meet community members and people is really quite difficult. Obviously, we're doing it online, but yeah, that having a cup and a chat is really key. And yeah, in terms of tangible outcomes, we're speaking about, you know, and the soft outcomes are okay. And we'll often strive for the big headlines. We've got so many people into volunteering, or we created this opportunity, but, you know, we could, I think it was one of the other speakers were talking about, you know, it's fine to say so many people have now got a skill or built confidence or learned a new thing or are more interested in heritage as a result of this intervention.
Yes,
so
wonderful.
Lots of good chat.
Amazing. Thank you, Lindsay. Amy, you've got your hand up as well. Do you want to tell us what happened in your room?
Yeah, sure. We had a mix of larger and smaller organisations, and then a mix of different roles within those organisations and institutions. And we had sort of a common consensus that there was a lot of information today, and all of it like incredibly valuable. And we were inspired and engaged that there are, like, sometimes when you are in this work, like, you sort of feel like you're so focused on what you're doing that you forget that there are amazing other people across the country doing a similar job. So thanks very much for that little bit of a boost. We talked mostly about how we can progress participatory practices. I feel like, or we sort of felt that within our teams or within our roles, that we understood what those practices were, but having those moments of co-production or collaboration, having those moments of spreading that across teams, where maybe people are a little bit more precious about the power that they hold, or that the programs that they want to present, and how we can better advocate within organizations those practices, and that's sometimes easier said than done. And then we also talked about how we can make museums places of civic participation, and not necessarily places where we just go and view objects, and this can maybe be brought back to the governance of those museums and considering qualitative evaluations.
Amazing, nice point to finish on. We have just a few more minutes left, so I'm going to take Sarah's feedback and then we'll wrap up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Sarah?
Yeah. Feel free to butt in, anybody, if I miss anything, but I was squirreling stuff down. We talked a lot about process and the time it takes to do some of this stuff well, and the space that takes, and how we talk about it and the language around it. So sometimes it is just having a chat, but sometimes that is all the complicated things that we talked about that are really wonderful, and how we kind of, I suppose, share that with the wider organization, and how we map that process, because often the way we map is all based on outcomes and things that happen at the end, or the well-being that happens at the end and through the delivery. And actually, is there a way of us mapping those relationships to quantify some of that time, to allow people to, I guess, measure that so that it has a higher standing, I suppose, in what we're doing, and whether that's the right thing to do at all, and whether actually that should just be appreciated for what it is. We also talked about the connection to purpose and need. So the need of the wider community, and how councils often do have a wider understanding of what the need is to the wider community, and then often the disconnect between how museums fulfill some of that need, and a lot like you were saying, Sally, in the beginning, and how we can kind of connect those things together around a strategy for the museum and how the museum fulfills some of that need. They also talked a lot about how this has been really useful, the kind of thinking about the long term really into the future. Also a conversation around pay and volunteers, and how that was really interesting, and they were looking forward to the next conference event around that.
Amazing. I think it's that last point about paying participants is such a challenge, isn't it? Because obviously we'd all like to, but it's how you can negotiate it along the way. Thanks everybody for your feedback, and for your comments, and for your enthusiasm throughout the day. It's been a real pleasure to be part of. Our speakers have been brilliant, I think, notwithstanding some technical issues. So thank you all for your participation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of it. Yeah, thank you all. Have a lovely evening. And that's it from us.